What if an entire civilization disappeared without leaving a single clear trace? No final battle, no written farewell, no obvious reason for its collapse. Across the world, archaeologists continue to uncover mysterious ruins, abandoned cities, and forgotten cultures that seem to have vanished almost overnight. What really happened to these lost people, and could history still be hiding the answer? In today's video, we're uncovering one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into humanity's forgotten past. Let's begin. The first sign is not a towering monument or a royal tomb. It is a faint stain in the earth, almost invisible beneath fields that have been ploughed for centuries. A line of buried walls emerges only when the morning sun strikes at just the right angle. Fragments of broken pottery lie scattered across the soil, separated by hundreds of years yet resting only a few steps apart. A forgotten canal appears as a subtle curve in satellite imagery, impossible to notice from the ground. Piece by piece, the landscape whispers a story that history itself never wrote. Somewhere in this quiet terrain, an entire civilization rises, flourishes, and disappears so completely that even its own name is lost. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What makes this mystery different from so many others is not simply that people vanish. Human societies have always risen and fallen, kingdoms collapse beneath invading armies, cities sink beneath volcanic ash, empires fragment into rival states, yet even after catastrophe, names often survive. Chronicles remember kings, inscriptions preserve victories, legends keep distant memories alive. Here something altogether stranger seems to happen. An organized society leaves behind roads, homes, workshops, fields, cemeteries, and remarkable engineering. Yet almost no written voice remains to explain who these people believe themselves to be. The silence is unsettling because it feels unnatural. Civilizations usually want to be remembered. They carve stone monuments, they celebrate rulers, they record laws, trade, and religion. They build temples that proclaim permanence. But every so often, archaeologists uncover evidence of communities whose achievements far exceed the historical attention they receive. Their fingerprints cover entire regions while their identities dissolve into the passing centuries. Standing upon one of these ancient sites today offers almost no sense of the world that once exists here. Wind moves through ordinary grass. Birds settle where crowded neighborhoods once stand. Farmers unknowingly cultivate soil enriched by generations of forgotten labor. Beneath every step rests the accumulated remains of thousands of daily lives. Children once chased one another across open courtyards. Craftsmen shape stone, bone, clay, and wood into useful objects. Families gather around evening fires while smoke drifts into skies that look remarkably similar to those above the modern landscape. Nothing about those ordinary moments suggests that history will eventually erase almost every memory of the people living them. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more surprising the picture becomes. Rather than isolated villages, they begin finding planned settlements, connected through sophisticated networks. Storage facilities indicate careful management of food supplies. Standardized tools suggest shared traditions extending across surprisingly large distances. Decorative objects appear hundreds of kilometers from the places where their raw materials originate, revealing trade routes that quietly bind distant communities together. Such discoveries challenge an older assumption that history moves only through famous civilizations whose names fill textbooks. Instead, the archaeological record increasingly reveals a far more crowded ancient world. Countless societies flourish beyond the attention of surviving written records. Some interact with neighboring kingdoms, others remain geographically isolated. Many simply leave too little written evidence to survive the accidents of time. That absence of writing, however, does not necessarily mean an absence of complexity. Modern archaeology no longer measures civilization solely through surviving texts. Urban planning, specialized labor agricultural systems, long-distance exchange ritual architecture, environmental management and social organization all leave physical traces. Even when written documents disappear, landscapes themselves become archives waiting patiently beneath layers of sediment. Sometimes those archives remain hidden for thousands of years. Entire settlements vanish beneath deserts as shifting dunes slowly bury streets and homes. Dense forests reclaim abandoned fields until enormous trees grow where marketplaces once stand. Rivers alter their courses, covering ancient neighborhoods beneath flood deposits several meters thick. Earthquakes reshape valleys, coastlines retreat or advance. Sea levels rise after the end of ice ages, drowning settlements that had once overlooked fertile plains. Nature proves remarkably efficient at concealing human achievement. Ironically, the very processes that erase civilizations from sight can also preserve them. Thick layers of mud protect footprints from erosion. Dry desert air shields wooden objects that would quickly decay elsewhere. Waterlogged soils preserve seeds, woven baskets, and even fragments of ancient meals. In rare circumstances, entire neighborhoods survive almost untouched beneath sediment, waiting for chance discoveries centuries later. Even then, reconstruction remains extraordinarily difficult. Archaeology resembles assembling an immense puzzle after most of its pieces have disappeared. Every recovered object carries valuable information, but no single artifact tells the complete story. A broken grinding stone reveals food preparation, but says little about political organization. Animal bones indicate diet, but cannot fully explain religious beliefs. House foundations reveal architectural skill, while remaining silent about the language once spoken inside those walls. Because of this, scholars constantly distinguish between evidence and interpretation. A cluster of large buildings may indicate administrative authority, or it may simply reflect generations of communal construction. Wide roads could support trade ceremonial processions or seasonal migration. Defensive walls may protect against warfare, dangerous wildlife flooding, or combinations of all three. The evidence remains incomplete, forcing researchers to balance careful observation with cautious inference. Yet some conclusions grow stronger as discoveries accumulate. When hundreds of settlements display similar construction methods across enormous territories, coincidence becomes increasingly unlikely. When identical pottery styles appear over many centuries, shared traditions become visible. When irrigation systems transform harsh landscapes into productive farmland, coordinated planning becomes difficult to deny. Gradually, individual discoveries begin connecting into broader patterns that reveal organized societies operating on impressive scales. Still, one haunting question refuses to disappear. If such a civilization truly exists, where do its people go? Human populations rarely vanish overnight. More often, they migrate, merge with neighboring communities, adapt to changing environments, or gradually transform into new cultural identities. The descendants continue living even when the civilization itself fades. Languages evolve, religious practices change, political systems collapse while families simply relocate. What later generations remember may preserve only faint echoes of much older worlds. This possibility changes the mystery entirely. Perhaps the civilization does not disappear because its people become extinct. Perhaps it disappears because history quietly absorbs them. Their descendants build new settlements, adopt different customs, and eventually forget where their ancestors once lived. Centuries later, strangers walk across abandoned foundations without realizing they're crossing the remains of one of humanity's forgotten achievements. The landscape remembers what human memory does not. Every buried canal, every weathered stone foundation, every discarded tool, and every microscopic grain of ancient pollen carries fragments of a story stretching across thousands of years. None alone provides the answer. Together they invite an extraordinary investigation into how entire worlds can flourish beyond recorded memory and then dissolve so completely that only the Earth itself continues telling their story. That investigation begins not with certainty, but with scattered clues waiting patiently beneath the surface, where one of history's greatest disappearances still lingers in silence. Long before cities rise from stone and brick, before rulers claim territories and merchants carry goods across distant frontiers, the land itself prepares the conditions that make civilization possible. Thousands of years before anyone builds a permanent settlement, rivers carve valleys through soft sediment, seasonal floods spread fertile soil across broad plains, and changing climates slowly transform landscapes that had once been inhospitable. The civilization that will one day vanish without leaving a trace begins not with people, but with an environment unusually generous to those willing to understand it. At the close of the last ice age, enormous glaciers retreat across much of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels continue rising as frozen water returns to the oceans, reshaping coastlines around the world. Vast grasslands become forests in some regions, while others experience expanding wetlands, newly flowing rivers, and fertile floodplains. These transformations unfold gradually over centuries, allowing plants, animals, and eventually human communities to adapt to changing conditions. For generations, small bands of hunter-gatherers move through these evolving landscapes with remarkable flexibility. They understand the seasonal rhythms of migrating animals, the flowering cycles of edible plants, and the locations where fresh water remains reliable even during dry years. Their knowledge is intimate rather than written, passed from one generation to the next through observation and experience. Every hill, stream, and grove becomes part of a living memory that guides survival. Over time, subtle changes begin to alter this relationship between people and the land. Certain valleys consistently produce abundant wild grains. Riverbanks support dense populations of fish and waterfowl. Forest edges provide nuts, fruits, and game in predictable patterns. Instead of moving constantly, some groups begin returning to the same places year after year. Temporary camps gradually become seasonal villages, and seasonal villages slowly develop into permanent settlements. This transition is neither sudden nor universal. Scholars still debate exactly how quickly farming spreads in different regions, and the evidence remains incomplete. Some communities cultivate crops while continuing to hunt extensively. Others rely on fishing for centuries before embracing agriculture. Human societies experiment with different ways of living, adapting their choices to local environments, rather than following a single path toward civilization. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that permanence grows slowly. The earliest houses are modest structures built from timber reeds, packed earth or stone gathered nearby. They're practical rather than monumental, designed to shelter families through changing seasons. Yet every permanent dwelling represents a profound shift in human history. Once people invest labor in building homes that will last for years, they also invest in surrounding fields, storage pits, irrigation channels, and relationships with neighboring communities. The landscape begins to change alongside them. Small clearings appear where forests once stood. Controlled burning encourages fresh vegetation for grazing animals. Simple canals redirect seasonal floodwaters toward cultivated fields. Stone tools become increasingly specialized for harvesting grain, shaping wood, grinding flour, and constructing buildings. None of these developments seems revolutionary in isolation, but together they signal an entirely new relationship between humanity and nature. Food surpluses emerge gradually, almost unnoticed at first. Successful harvests allow families to store grain beyond immediate needs. Clay vessels protect seeds from moisture and pests. Underground storage chambers maintain cooler temperatures throughout the year. These reserves reduce the risks posed by poor harvests and encourage larger populations to remain together rather than dispersing in search of food. Population growth follows naturally. Villages that once contain only a few dozen people expand into communities of several hundred. Houses cluster more closely together, creating winding paths that evolve into recognizable streets. Shared spaces appear where tools are repaired, food is processed, and ceremonies strengthen social bonds. Children grow up knowing neighbors beyond their immediate families, while older generations pass on increasingly specialized skills. Craftsmanship flourishes in these conditions. Some individuals devote more time to pottery, producing vessels remarkably uniform in shape and decoration. Others become expert stoneworkers capable of fashioning blades far sharper than earlier generations could achieve. Weavers transform plant fibers and animal wool into durable textiles. Woodworkers create furniture carts and agricultural implements that increase efficiency throughout the settlement. Trade quietly expands these possibilities. Not every valuable material exists locally. Fine stone suitable for tools may lie hundreds of kilometers away. Shells prized for ornamentation come from distant coastlines. Bright minerals used as pigments originate in isolated mountain ranges. Archaeologists repeatedly discover these materials far from their natural sources, demonstrating that even relatively early communities participate in surprisingly extensive exchange networks. These trade routes carry far more than physical goods. Ideas travel alongside merchants. New farming techniques spread between neighboring valleys. Decorative styles appear across wide regions. Religious symbols become recognizable far beyond their original communities. Technologies evolve as craftsmen observe unfamiliar methods introduced by visitors. Civilization grows not through isolation, but through countless connections linking distant populations over generations. Leadership also becomes more complex. Small bands of mobile hunter-gatherers often rely on flexible social structures, but larger permanent settlements require greater coordination. Irrigation systems demand collective maintenance. Food storage must be protected. Disputes require resolution. Seasonal planting and harvesting benefit from organized labor. Authority likely develops gradually through respected elders, skilled organizers, religious specialists, or influential families rather than sudden political revolutions. The evidence rarely reveals exactly how these early governments function. There are no surviving constitutions, royal decrees, or official records to explain decision-making. Instead, archaeologists examine settlement layouts, burial practices, and differences in housing to infer patterns of social organization. Some communities display striking equality, while others suggest increasing concentrations of wealth and influence. Religion begins leaving more visible traces as well. Small shrines appear within settlements. Carefully arranged burials indicate beliefs about death extending beyond practical necessity. Animal remains deposited in ceremonial contexts hint at rituals whose meanings remain elusive. Carved figurines, symbolic decorations, and deliberately aligned structures suggest that spiritual life becomes increasingly woven into the fabric of everyday existence. No single explanation fully accounts for these developments. Different regions undoubtedly follow different paths shaped by unique environmental and cultural circumstances. Yet across many parts of the ancient world, remarkably similar patterns emerge. Stable climates encourage agriculture. Agriculture supports larger populations. Larger populations foster specialization, trade leadership, and increasingly sophisticated social institutions. By now, the civilization that history will one day forget has not yet built its greatest cities, but its foundations are firmly in place. Generations have transformed the landscape through patient labor rather than dramatic conquest. Rivers no longer flow entirely according to nature's design. Fields replace stretches of wilderness. Roads begin linking neighboring settlements. Communities recognize shared traditions extending far beyond individual villages. The people themselves may never imagine that future archaeologists will struggle to reconstruct their existence from scattered fragments beneath the soil. To them, this world simply feels permanent. Children are born into houses their grandparents helped construct. Harvest festivals mark familiar seasons. Traders arrive with goods expected each year. Farmers repair canals dug by ancestors whose names are already fading from memory. Stability becomes so familiar that few can imagine how fragile it truly is. History repeatedly demonstrates that civilizations often collapse, not because they are weak, but because they become deeply adapted to environmental conditions that eventually change. The more successful a society becomes, the more thoroughly its systems depend upon predictable rivers, dependable rainfall, established trade routes, and social cooperation. When those foundations begin shifting even slowly, the consequences may unfold over centuries. For now, however, the forgotten civilization stands at the beginning of its ascent. Its people have learned to shape the land, organize communities, and create enduring traditions. The world around them appears rich with opportunity, and the future promises continued growth. Beneath that confidence, unseen forces are already moving across climates, landscapes, and human history, quietly preparing challenges that no one yet recognizes. The transformation from scattered farming villages into a true civilization rarely announces itself with a single dramatic moment. No trumpet sounds across the valleys. No solitary ruler suddenly declares the beginning of a new age. Instead, generation after generation builds upon the work of those who came before, until one day the landscape bears unmistakable signs of a society whose complexity far exceeds anything that existed only a few centuries earlier. By then the change feels ordinary to those living within it, even though it represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. Across the fertile plains, settlements continue multiplying. Some remain modest villages surrounded by cultivated fields, but others begin attracting growing populations from neighboring regions. Their locations are rarely accidental. They stand beside dependable rivers at crossroads linking distant communities, or on elevated ground safe from seasonal flooding. Geography quietly shapes destiny, rewarding places that can gather resources, people, and ideas into a single center. As these communities expand, their appearance changes in subtle but important ways. Houses become more standardized in size and orientation. Streets emerge not as random footpaths, but as carefully maintained routes connecting neighborhoods, storage facilities, workshops, and ceremonial spaces. Open courtyards provide places for markets, gatherings, and communal labor. The settlement itself begins functioning as an organized whole, rather than a loose collection of individual households. This growing order reflects something deeper than architecture. It suggests shared expectations about how society should function. Thousands of people who may never meet each other still participate in systems requiring cooperation on a remarkable scale. Irrigation canals must be cleaned before planting seasons. Harvests must be stored and distributed efficiently. Roads require maintenance. Livestock need protection. Conflicts between families or neighboring settlements must be resolved before they threaten wider stability. Such coordination cannot depend entirely upon informal relationships. Although the evidence remains incomplete, archaeologists increasingly recognize signs of administrative organization within these expanding communities. Certain buildings are noticeably larger than ordinary homes. Some contain rows of storage rooms capable of holding immense quantities of grain. Others appear designed for gatherings involving large numbers of people. Clay ceilings, standardized weights, and carefully measured construction all hint at systems for managing resources with surprising precision. The people responsible for this work may never call themselves officials in the modern sense, yet their influence becomes visible through the infrastructure surrounding them. Every successful harvest collected into communal storage represents trust in shared institutions. Every canal repaired through coordinated labor demonstrates a society capable of organizing thousands of individual decisions into collective action. Trade accelerates this transformation. Caravans move steadily between distant settlements carrying goods impossible to obtain locally. Copper travels from mineral-rich highlands. Fine stone arrives from quarries many days away. Marine shells appear hundreds of kilometers inland while rare pigments cross mountains and deserts alike. These exchanges are not occasional curiosities but increasingly regular movements that bind communities into extensive economic networks. With trade comes specialization. Not every family now produces every necessity for survival. Skilled potters devote themselves almost entirely to ceramics, perfecting techniques refined over decades. Metalworkers experiment with heating ores to temperatures that reveal entirely new possibilities. Stonemasons cut blocks with extraordinary precision. Weavers produce textiles so consistent that their patterns become recognizable across entire regions. This division of labor changes daily life in profound ways. Children no longer inherit only the practical knowledge required for farming. Some grow up inside workshops where generations of artisans preserve closely guarded techniques. Others learn to manage trade expeditions or oversee irrigation systems. Religious specialists dedicate themselves to ceremonies marking seasonal cycles, births, marriages, and deaths. Society becomes increasingly interconnected with every occupation depending upon the work of many others. Food production remains the foundation supporting all of it. Agricultural innovation continues quietly but relentlessly. Farmers develop better methods for rotating crops, managing soil fertility, and controlling water supplies. Domesticated animals provide traction for heavier equipment, allowing larger fields to be cultivated with less labor. Storage technology improves reducing spoilage and protecting reserves against rodents, insects, and moisture. The result is not merely abundance but resilience. Successful societies rarely survive because every harvest is perfect. They survive because they prepare for imperfect years. Granaries filled during prosperous seasons provide insurance against drought flooding or disease-affecting crops. Communities capable of managing temporary shortages gain enormous advantages over those living harvest to harvest. Religion evolves alongside these practical achievements. Large ceremonial structures begin appearing within major settlements. Some are elevated above surrounding buildings, suggesting their importance within community life. Carefully arranged offerings accompany burials. Animal sacrifices leave recognizable archaeological signatures. Decorative motifs repeat across wide geographical areas, indicating beliefs shared by populations separated by considerable distances. Yet the meanings behind these symbols remain frustratingly elusive. Without surviving written explanations, scholars must infer religious practices from physical evidence alone. A carved figure may represent a deity, an ancestor, a protective spirit, or something entirely different. Circular enclosures might host seasonal festivals, judicial gatherings, or astronomical observations. The evidence points toward rich spiritual traditions, but their precise nature continues to invite debate. One particularly intriguing pattern emerges through settlement planning itself. Many major structures appear deliberately aligned with features of the natural world. Some face the rising sun during important points in the solar year. Others correspond with surrounding hills, rivers, or prominent stars visible during specific seasons. Whether these alignments reflect practical calendars, ceremonial symbolism, or both remains uncertain, but they reveal careful observation of the environment extending far beyond immediate survival. Knowledge becomes one of the civilization's greatest resources. Generations accumulate practical understanding impossible for any single individual to acquire alone. Farmers know precisely when rivers usually rise. Builders understand which foundations resist seasonal flooding. Traders memorize routes spanning hundreds of kilometers. Craftsmen refine techniques through countless experiments, gradually producing objects of increasing quality and consistency. This accumulated experience forms an invisible inheritance passed from parents to children. Unlike monuments built from stone, much of a civilization's greatest achievement exists inside human memory. Skills, traditions, languages, songs, rituals, and practical knowledge flow continuously between generations. Archaeology rarely captures these intangible elements directly, yet they likely constitute the true heart of ancient society. The civilization now reaches a level of sophistication that would surprise many modern observers. Its people may not construct pyramids visible from space, or leave monumental inscriptions carved into cliffs, but complexity expresses itself in quieter ways. Efficient food production supports dense populations. Trade links distant regions. Standardized craftsmanship demonstrates shared traditions. Organized labor shapes landscapes through irrigation roads and public construction. Social institutions coordinate thousands of lives without constant conflict. Still, one remarkable feature distinguishes this civilization from many better-known ancient powers. It leaves remarkably little behind that proclaims individual rulers or celebrates military conquest. Archaeologists uncover relatively few unmistakable palaces compared with other contemporary civilizations. Monumental statues glorifying kings are scarce or absent. Elaborate royal tombs fail to dominate the landscape. Instead, much of the surviving evidence reflects ordinary community lifehouses, workshops, wells, drainage systems, marketplaces, and carefully planned neighborhoods. This absence has fascinated researchers for decades. Did authority operate differently here? Were leaders deliberately less visible? Did perishable materials carry political messages that simply failed to survive? Or has archaeology only uncovered part of the larger picture? Scholars still debate these possibilities, and no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. What does seem increasingly clear is that this forgotten civilization develops its own distinctive path. Its strength lies not solely in spectacular monuments, but in the remarkable efficiency of everyday systems supporting thousands of interconnected lives. From the outside, it appears stable, prosperous, and adaptable. Yet beneath this success, unseen vulnerabilities slowly accumulate. The irrigation canals require constant maintenance. Trade routes depend upon distant partners remaining equally stable. Agricultural productivity assumes familiar rainfall patterns will continue. Population growth increases pressure upon surrounding resources. Every new success binds the civilization more tightly to conditions that cannot remain unchanged forever. For generations, however, those dangers remain invisible. Markets stay busy. Harvests continue filling granaries. Children inherit thriving communities from their parents. The civilization appears to have discovered a formula for lasting prosperity, unaware that the very systems responsible for its remarkable rise will one day become part of the mystery surrounding its extraordinary disappearance. By the time the civilization reaches its full maturity, it no longer exists as a scattering of prosperous settlements. It has become an interconnected world stretching across rivers, plains, hills, and trade corridors that together support hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people. Modern archaeologists continue to debate the exact size of its population, but every new survey reveals another buried settlement, another forgotten workshop, another carefully engineered landscape that expands the boundaries of what once seemed possible. Perhaps the greatest surprise is not simply the civilization's scale, but how quietly it achieves it. Unlike many ancient kingdoms remembered through colossal monuments or endless military campaigns, this society invests extraordinary effort in the ordinary mechanics of everyday life. Its greatest achievements are not towering statues visible from distant horizons. They are streets that drain efficiently after heavy rain, neighborhoods arranged with remarkable consistency, wells that provide reliable water warehouses capable of storing enormous quantities of grain, and workshops producing tools of impressive uniformity. From above, if one could somehow look down upon the civilization during its height, the settlements would reveal patterns impossible to appreciate from ground level. Major roads connect urban centers with surrounding farming villages. Smaller paths branch outward toward grazing lands, forests, and river crossings. Irrigation canals divide fertile plains into carefully managed agricultural zones. Defensive walls appear around some communities but remain absent from others, suggesting differing local conditions rather than a single military strategy. These networks create resilience. When one region experiences a poor harvest, food can move from another. If local resources become scarce, traders arrive with supplies gathered from distant settlements. Craftsmen specialize because they trust broader exchange systems to provide necessities they no longer produce themselves. The civilization functions almost like a living organism, with countless communities depending upon one another through relationships built over generations. The evidence for this interdependence continues to grow with each archaeological discovery. Chemical analysis of pottery reveals clay originating far from where finished vessels are eventually found. Stone tools are traced back to quarries separated by hundreds of kilometers. Tiny beads fashioned from marine shells appear deep inland while mountain minerals travel toward coastal settlements. Even microscopic examination of ancient teeth allows researchers to identify individuals who spend childhoods in one region before living their adult lives somewhere entirely different. People are moving far more often than earlier generations of archaeologists once imagined. Migration is not necessarily a sign of instability. On the contrary, thriving civilizations often encourage mobility. Merchants travel with caravans. Skilled craftsmen relocate where opportunities exist. Families establish new farming communities along expanding frontiers. Religious gatherings draw visitors from multiple regions. Seasonal labor supports construction projects or major harvests. The civilization grows increasingly connected through human movement as much as through trade. This mobility also spreads ideas. Architectural styles once limited to individual settlements begin appearing across wide territories. Pottery decoration becomes increasingly standardized. Similar weights and measures emerge in distant marketplaces. Construction techniques improve simultaneously in regions separated by many days of travel. These patterns suggest regular communication rather than isolated innovation. Knowledge itself becomes an important commodity. Experienced engineers understand how to control floodwaters without destroying valuable farmland. Builders discover methods for producing stronger foundations in unstable soils. Farmers learn which crop combinations maintain fertility over many growing seasons. Physicians, though limited by the scientific understanding of their age, accumulate practical knowledge about injuries, childbirth, medicinal plants, and sanitation, One particularly remarkable feature distinguishes many of the civilization's larger settlements. Water is managed with exceptional care. Excavations repeatedly uncover sophisticated drainage systems running beneath streets, carrying wastewater away from residential neighborhoods. Wells appear throughout urban districts, reducing dependence upon a single water source. Channels direct seasonal floodwaters while limiting erosion. Storage reservoirs preserve supplies during drier months. These achievements require long-term planning, coordinated maintenance, and considerable technical understanding. Such infrastructure rarely attracts the admiration inspired by temples or palaces, yet historians increasingly recognize that successful water management may represent one of the greatest engineering accomplishments of the ancient world. Civilizations flourish not merely because they build impressive monuments, but because they solve practical problems affecting thousands of ordinary people every day. Clean water, reliable drainage, and efficient food storage quietly sustain societies for centuries. Daily life within these thriving communities reflects both routine and sophistication. Before sunrise, farmers leave through city gates toward surrounding fields, where grain, legumes, fruits, and vegetables mature according to carefully observed seasonal rhythms. Herdsmen guide livestock toward grazing lands beyond cultivated areas. Potters begin shaping clay while temperatures remain cool. Metal workers prepare furnaces requiring hours of careful attention. Merchants unpack goods arriving after journeys lasting weeks or even months. Within homes, meals are prepared using ingredients gathered through networks extending far beyond individual households. Bread baked from cultivated grain accompanies vegetables, fruits, dairy products, and occasionally meat or fish depending upon local availability and social status. Grinding stones worn smooth by countless hands testify to generations of daily food preparation. Charred seeds preserved beneath collapsed buildings reveal surprising dietary diversity, including crops adapted to varying climates across the civilization's territory. Children grow up surrounded by both tradition and innovation. They learn practical skills from parents and grandparents while observing technologies unavailable to earlier generations. Games carved into stone floors hint at leisure shared across centuries. Small figurines suggest imaginative play remarkably familiar despite the passage of thousands of years. Education likely occurs primarily within families and workshops, where experience passes directly between generations rather than through formal schools. The elderly occupy important positions within community memory. In societies lacking extensive written records, older generations preserve invaluable knowledge. They remember unusual floods, severe droughts, successful harvests, traditional ceremonies, and genealogies linking families across decades. Their experience helps younger community members interpret present events through the lens of accumulated history. Ironically, this reliance upon living memory also creates vulnerability. Knowledge preserved primarily through oral tradition depends upon uninterrupted transmission. Wars, epidemics, migration, or environmental disasters capable of disrupting generations may erase information that written documents might otherwise preserve. The civilization's greatest archive exists not in libraries but in human minds. Religion continues providing shared meaning across expanding populations. Ceremonies marking planting seasons, harvest births, marriages, and burials reinforce social unity. Sacred spaces serve not only spiritual purposes, but also strengthen relationships among communities spread across considerable distances. Although the exact beliefs remain uncertain, recurring symbols found throughout the archaeological record suggest common traditions binding diverse settlements into a broader cultural identity. At first glance, everything points toward lasting stability. Population continues increasing, agriculture remains productive, trade flourishes, engineering grows more sophisticated. Urban planning reflects careful organization rather than chaotic expansion. Few signs suggest imminent catastrophe. To anyone living during these prosperous generations, the future likely appears secure. Yet archaeology often teaches a sobering lesson. The strongest civilizations rarely recognize the moment when conditions begin changing against them. The earliest warnings seldom resemble dramatic disasters. Rivers alter their seasonal patterns almost imperceptibly. Rainfall decreases gradually over several generations rather than disappearing overnight. Forests retreat as growing populations consume more timber. Productive soils slowly lose fertility after centuries of cultivation. Trade partners experience difficulties invisible to distant communities. No single event seems capable of threatening an entire civilization. Instead, small disruptions begin accumulating beneath the surface of ordinary life. A harvest proves slightly less abundant than expected. Wells require deeper excavation. Traders arrive later than usual. Families relocate from marginal farmland toward more reliable regions. Repairs to canals become increasingly frequent. None of these developments appears extraordinary in isolation, yet together they represent the earliest hints that the remarkable balance sustaining this forgotten civilization may not endure forever. Its people continue building, farming, trading, celebrating and raising children with confidence earned through centuries of success. They cannot know that future generations will search desperately for their name, wondering how a society so sophisticated, so organized and so thoroughly woven into its landscape, could one day fade until almost nothing remained except buried foundations beneath silent fields. Prosperity rarely announces its arrival with celebration. More often it settles quietly into everyday life until abundance becomes so familiar that few people remember how different the world once was. For the civilization that will eventually disappear from history, this long period of stability becomes its defining achievement. Generations are born into a landscape that seems dependable, productive, and permanent. Fields continue yielding harvests. Trade routes remain open. Rivers follow patterns that have guided communities for centuries. Success no longer feels exceptional. It simply becomes the normal rhythm of existence. At dawn, the larger settlements awaken gradually rather than all at once. Smoke rises from hundreds of hearths as families prepare morning meals. Bakers grind grain that has been stored safely through the previous season. Potters uncover clay left to mature beneath damp coverings. Metalworkers inspect furnaces before beginning another day of careful experimentation with heat and ore. Livestock move through narrow streets towards surrounding pasturelands, while merchants arrange goods beneath shaded market shelters. The sounds of civilization are surprisingly ordinary. Stone striking stone as tools are sharpened. Wooden cartwheels creaking beneath heavy loads. Children laughing while carrying water from neighborhood wells. Dogs barking at unfamiliar travelers entering through city gates. Birds gathering near granaries where scattered grain attracts easy meals. None of these moments seems remarkable on its own, yet together they create the steady pulse of a thriving society. The markets form the heart of daily interaction. Here farmers exchange surplus crops for crafted goods they cannot produce themselves. Fishermen display fresh catches preserved with salt or smoke. Textile makers spread woven fabrics dyed with minerals and plants gathered from distant landscapes. Traders unpack unfamiliar objects carried across mountains, deserts, or river valleys, bringing materials that transform local craftsmanship. Conversations unfold in several dialects. Although the civilization shares broad cultural traditions, regional differences remain. Travelers introduce unfamiliar expressions, customs, and techniques wherever they arrive. New ideas spread almost invisibly through countless ordinary exchanges. A more efficient farming tool demonstrated in one valley gradually appears hundreds of kilometers away. Decorative pottery patterns migrate alongside merchants. Construction methods evolve as builders observe successful designs from neighbouring settlements. Innovation does not belong only to great inventors. It emerges through thousands of practical improvements contributed by ordinary people solving everyday problems. A farmer discovers a better method for directing irrigation water across uneven ground. A potter refines kiln temperatures to produce stronger vessels. A carpenter develops joints requiring fewer wooden pegs while supporting heavier roofs. A shepherd recognizes breeding practices producing healthier animals over successive generations. Each improvement appears modest. Together they steadily increase the civilization's productivity and resilience. The surrounding countryside reflects centuries of accumulated labor. Fields stretch farther than they once did, carefully divided according to soil quality and access to water. Orchards provide fruit during different seasons, reducing dependence upon single harvests. Grazing lands support growing herds without exhausting available vegetation. Forests, though gradually shrinking in some regions, continue supplying timber fuel and wild resources essential to everyday life. The relationship between town and countryside remains inseparable. Urban centres depend upon surrounding farmers for food, while rural communities rely upon towns for specialised tools, religious gatherings and trade opportunities. Roads connecting these settlements carry constant movement rather than occasional traffic. Grain travels towards storage facilities. Finished goods move outward into farming villages. News marriages, seasonal festivals and religious ceremonies strengthen relationships, extending well beyond individual communities. Even death reflects the civilization's remarkable organization. Archaeological excavations reveal carefully planned cemeteries rather than scattered burials. Graves often follow consistent orientations suggesting shared beliefs regarding the afterlife or cosmic order. Some individuals receive finely crafted ornaments, pottery or tools, while others are buried more simply. These differences hint at social distinctions, although the contrasts appear less extreme than those found in many contemporary civilizations dominated by powerful kings or elaborate aristocracies. Scholars continue debating what these burial practices reveal. Do relatively modest differences suggest a more equal society, or have wealthier tombs simply failed to survive? Organic materials decay rapidly under many environmental conditions, potentially erasing signs of status that once existed. The evidence remains incomplete, reminding researchers how easily preservation shapes historical interpretation. Health varies across the population. Skeletons recovered from ancient cemeteries reveal both hardship and resilience. Many individuals bear signs of physically demanding labor. Worn joints indicate years spent farming, carrying heavy loads, or working with repetitive tools. Healed fractures demonstrate that injured people often survive long enough for bones to mend, suggesting families and communities care for those temporarily unable to work. Teeth preserve especially revealing evidence. Microscopic wear patterns expose diets rich in ground grains mixed with tiny particles of stone from milling equipment. Cavities become increasingly common as agriculture expands and carbohydrate consumption rises. Chemical analysis allows scientists to reconstruct nutritional patterns, seasonal shortages, and even migration between different ecological regions during an individual's lifetime. Disease undoubtedly exists, but its exact impact remains difficult to measure. Crowded settlements create favorable conditions for infections spreading between people. Domesticated animals increase opportunities for diseases crossing species barriers. Water supplies, despite impressive engineering, cannot eliminate every health risk. Yet organized sanitation systems found in several major settlements likely reduce some dangers compared with less carefully planned communities. Life expectancy remains modest by modern standards. Many children never reach adulthood. Women face substantial risks during childbirth. Injuries that would be easily treated today may prove fatal. Nevertheless, enough people survive into old age to preserve valuable knowledge across generations, maintaining continuity essential to the civilization's success. Religion weaves quietly through every stage of life. Rather than dominating public space through overwhelming monuments, spiritual practice appears deeply integrated into ordinary routines. Small household shrines suggest family rituals performed within homes. Community ceremonies likely coincide with planting harvest seasonal changes and important life events. Offerings discovered beneath building foundations hint at beliefs connecting prosperity with divine favor or ancestral protection. Astronomical observation may also play an important role. Several ancient structures align closely with solstices, equinoxes, or significant celestial events. These alignments probably serve practical as well as symbolic purposes. Accurate understanding of seasonal cycles helps farmers determine optimal planting times, while religious ceremonies reinforce the shared calendar binding communities together. Knowledge of the sky becomes another invisible form of infrastructure. Without written calendars, widely preserved generations rely upon experienced observers capable of interpreting changing positions of the sun, moon, and stars. Agricultural success depends partly upon this accumulated understanding, passed carefully between specialists and ordinary farmers alike. The civilization appears astonishingly balanced. Its economy functions through cooperation rather than constant conquest. Its settlements emphasize practical planning. Trade encourages exchange instead of isolation. Engineering supports everyday well-being. Religious traditions strengthen social cohesion without necessarily requiring spectacular displays of centralized power. Modern observers sometimes imagine ancient societies as perpetually unstable, but archaeology increasingly paints a different picture. This civilization enjoys centuries of relative continuity. Children inherit productive farms from parents who inherited them from grandparents. Craftsmen refine techniques over multiple generations. Roads remain in use long enough for repeated repairs to accumulate. Wells deepen gradually as water tables fluctuate. Houses are renovated rather than abandoned. The passage of time itself becomes visible in countless layers of maintenance rather than dramatic reconstruction. Yet prosperity always carries hidden costs. Growing populations require more farmland. Expanded agriculture consumes additional forests. Irrigation gradually alters soil chemistry in subtle ways. Trade networks become increasingly dependent upon distant regions remaining equally prosperous. Every successful decade encourages further expansion, making society ever more interconnected and therefore increasingly vulnerable to disruptions occurring far beyond any single settlement. No one notices the danger at first. The changes are measured not in days or years, but in generations. A river floods slightly less predictably than before. Timber becomes harder to obtain nearby, requiring longer journeys into remaining forests. Seasonal rains arrive a little later. One harvest proves disappointing, though another compensates. Families begin settling farther from traditional centres in search of fertile land. Individually, these developments seem unremarkable. Collectively, they mark the beginning of a transformation so gradual that those living through it can scarcely perceive its significance. The civilization remains prosperous, confident, and remarkably capable. Its people believe they are building a future as enduring as the rivers nourishing their fields. Beneath their feet, however, the landscape itself is beginning to change, and the first faint cracks in an apparently timeless world are slowly widening in ways that only centuries of hindsight will fully reveal. Civilizations rarely collapse because of a single disastrous decision. More often, they are slowly worn down by pressures that seem manageable when viewed individually, but become overwhelming when combined. A river shifts its course. A harvest fails more often than before. Trade becomes less predictable. forests retreat beyond easy reach. Population continues growing even as resources become harder to secure. None of these changes appears dramatic enough to threaten an entire society. Yet together they begin reshaping the future in ways almost impossible for those living through them to recognize. For generations, the forgotten civilization has mastered its environment with remarkable success. Irrigation channels transform dry plains into productive farmland. Roads connect distant communities. Reservoirs preserve precious water through changing seasons. These achievements create confidence that human ingenuity can overcome nearly every challenge nature presents. That confidence is understandable. The same engineering that protects one generation often serves the next. Children inherit canals dug by grandparents and fields cultivated for centuries. Settlements expand because experience suggests tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Stability itself becomes part of the civilization's identity. Yet nature never remains perfectly stable. Modern climate science combined with archaeological evidence preserved in lake sediments, cave formations, ancient pollen and river deposits reveals that many ancient societies experience environmental fluctuations lasting decades or even centuries. These changes are rarely visible within a single lifetime. Instead, they unfold gradually enough that each generation adapts to slightly different conditions than the one before. The forgotten civilization is no exception. Rainfall patterns begin shifting almost imperceptibly. At first, the differences are hardly noticeable. One planting season begins a little later than expected. A familiar stream carries less water through late summer. Farmers speak quietly about unusual weather, but assume conditions will soon return to normal. After all, every community has stories of difficult years followed by abundant harvests. The following decade brings more subtle irregularities. Floods arrive earlier in some regions and fail to appear altogether in others. River banks once renewed by seasonal sediment receive thinner deposits. Certain wells require deeper excavation before reaching dependable groundwater. Livestock must travel farther to reach reliable grazing areas. No single event causes panic. Instead, uncertainty becomes part of ordinary conversation. Experienced farmers begin comparing present conditions with memories inherited from their parents. Elders notice that planting calendars no longer align perfectly with familiar seasonal signs. Hunters travel greater distances before finding game in numbers once considered normal. The landscape is changing. One of the civilization's greatest strengths, its reliance on carefully managed water, also becomes one of its greatest vulnerabilities. Irrigation systems require consistency. Canals are designed according to expected river levels. Reservoirs depend upon regular replenishment. Agricultural schedules assume predictable flooding or rainfall. When those natural rhythms begin drifting away from long-established patterns, every carefully balanced system requires adjustment. Some communities adapt successfully. Engineers deepen canals to reach lower water levels. Farmers experiment with crops requiring less moisture. Reservoir walls are strengthened to capture scarce rainfall more efficiently. Wells are expanded using improved construction techniques. These efforts demonstrate remarkable resilience. Far from passively accepting environmental change, the civilization responds with ingenuity, accumulated through centuries of practical experience. But adaptation has limits. Each new solution demands labor. Repairing canals means fewer workers available during harvest. Digging deeper wells requires additional stone timber and skilled craftsmen. Clearing new farmland consumes forests that once protected soils from erosion. Communities begin making increasingly difficult choices about where limited resources should be invested. Trade offers temporary relief. Regions still enjoying favorable harvests export grain toward areas experiencing shortages. Caravans carry food alongside tools, livestock, and raw materials. Markets remain active. though prices fluctuate more noticeably than before. For a time, these exchange networks prevent local crises from becoming regional disasters, yet trade itself depends upon stability. If several distant regions experience similar environmental pressures simultaneously, surplus food becomes increasingly difficult to obtain. Merchants arriving after weeks of travel may discover that communities once known for abundant harvests now struggle to feed their own populations. The entire network begins feeling the strain. Archaeological evidence from several ancient civilizations reveals another consequence of prolonged environmental stress. People move. Migration is not necessarily an act of desperation. Families have always relocated in search of better farmland trade opportunities or marriage alliances. But when environmental conditions deteriorate gradually across wide areas, migration increases noticeably. Small farming villages nearest drying rivers begin losing population. Young families leave first seeking opportunities closer to larger settlements, where food storage remains more reliable. Older generations often stay behind, unwilling to abandon homes built by ancestors. The result is an uneven pattern of abandonment. Some communities continue functioning for decades despite shrinking populations. Others merge with neighboring settlements. A few disappear entirely, leaving behind houses that slowly collapse beneath wind and rain. Archaeologists frequently encounter this puzzling pattern. Rather than evidence of sudden destruction, they find settlements abandoned in stages. Doors are not smashed open. Homes are not burned to the ground. Personal possessions remain surprisingly limited, suggesting families carry away whatever they consider valuable before leaving. The departure is deliberate. It is also deeply human. Leaving an ancestral home is rarely a single moment. Families likely spend years debating whether conditions will improve. Each disappointing harvest strengthens the argument for moving. Each successful season encourages hope that stability will return. Some leave early and establish prosperous lives elsewhere. Others wait too long, investing precious labor into fields that continue yielding less with every passing decade. Meanwhile, larger urban centers experience their own challenges. Growing numbers of newcomers increase pressure on food supplies, housing, and public infrastructure. Well-serving previous generations now support far larger populations. Markets become more crowded. Competition for employment intensifies among craftsmen and laborers. Social tensions may begin emerging, although the archaeological record rarely preserves direct evidence of such disputes. What survives instead are indirect clues. New construction slows. Maintenance becomes less consistent. Public works, once carefully repaired every season, begin showing signs of neglect. Drainage channels fill gradually with sediment. Road surfaces deteriorate. Buildings damaged by floods or age remain partially unrepaired. None of these developments alone signals collapse. Taken together, however, they suggest administrative systems operating under increasing pressure. Scholars still debate the relative importance of environmental change compared with political, economic, or social factors. The evidence remains incomplete. Climate alone rarely destroys civilizations. Rather, environmental stress exposes weaknesses already present within complex societies. Communities capable of cooperation often survive difficult periods remarkably well. Those facing internal divisions may struggle even under comparatively modest challenges. For the forgotten civilization, the precise balance between these forces remains uncertain. What survives in the archaeological record suggests no dramatic moment when everything suddenly changes. Instead, prosperity begins fading around the edges. Trade continues, but less reliably. Agriculture persists, though, with declining productivity in some regions. Cities remain occupied, yet certain neighborhoods shrink while others fall silent. Children still play in familiar streets, unaware that their world is becoming fundamentally different from the one their grandparents knew. Perhaps that is the most haunting aspect of slow collapse. History often remembers spectacular disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, invading armies. But many civilizations disappear through quieter processes unfolding across generations. There is no single day when people awaken to discover their civilization has ended. Instead, ordinary life continues. Markets still open. Fields are still planted. Ceremonies are still observed. Parents still tell children that better seasons will return. Only centuries later, when archaeologists examine abandoned foundations and drying riverbeds, does the larger pattern become visible. The forgotten civilization has not yet vanished. Its cities still stand. Its roads still connect distant communities. Its traditions still shape everyday life. But beneath this appearance of continuity, invisible forces continue gathering strength. The society that once seemed perfectly adapted to its world is slowly discovering that the world itself is changing, and no civilization, however sophisticated, can remain untouched when the land beneath its foundations begins to follow a different course. The first unmistakable signs do not appear in the largest cities. They emerge at the edges of the civilization where life has always depended on a delicate balance between opportunity and risk. These frontier communities occupy fertile valleys that receive just enough rainfall to support farming villages built beside rivers that have never failed within living memory, and grazing lands where generations have watched the same seasonal patterns unfold. Here, even a modest shift in climate becomes impossible to ignore. Year after year, familiar rhythms begin slipping out of alignment. The spring floods arrive later than expected. In some regions, they come with unusual force, washing away irrigation embankments that have stood for generations. Elsewhere, they barely appear at all, leaving canals shallow and fields thirsty before summer has fully begun. Farmers who once relied on inherited calendars now find those calendars becoming less dependable with every passing season. The evidence preserved in lake sediments and ancient river deposits suggests that some parts of the ancient world experience prolonged periods of climatic instability. Rather than one catastrophic drought or one extraordinary flood, communities face decades of unpredictable weather. Wet years alternate with unusually dry ones. Temperatures fluctuate enough to affect growing seasons. Rivers that once followed dependable courses begin carving new channels across the landscape. For a civilization built upon careful planning, unpredictability becomes its greatest enemy. A single poor harvest can be managed. Granaries exist for precisely that reason. Two disappointing harvests test the strength of local reserves. Several decades of irregular production begin reshaping society itself. The first visible response is adaptation. Farmers experiment with different planting schedules. Crops that require abundant water gradually give way to varieties capable of surviving drier conditions. Fields closest to shrinking rivers are abandoned in favor of higher ground, where seasonal rainfall remains more reliable. Livestock herders expand their movements, searching for fresh grazing land farther from traditional settlements. These decisions are practical rather than dramatic. Families do not believe they are witnessing the decline of a civilization. They believe they are responding to another difficult period, much like challenges their ancestors have overcome before. In many places, those efforts succeed. Communities survive through flexibility, proving once again that ancient societies possess remarkable resilience. Archaeological evidence repeatedly shows that people are rarely passive victims of environmental change. They modify irrigation systems, diversify crops, exchange resources with neighbors, and relocate when necessary. Yet every successful adaptation comes with a cost. Digging new canals requires thousands of hours of labor. Clearing fresh farmland consumes forests that once stabilized local ecosystems. Moving entire villages means abandoning homes, cemeteries, and fields cultivated by generations of ancestors. Even when migration is peaceful, it represents an emotional rupture impossible to measure through archaeology alone. Imagine leaving a house built by grandparents. Imagine walking away from orchards planted decades earlier, from familiar paths, sacred places, and neighbors whose families have lived beside yours for centuries. The archaeological record preserves broken walls. It does not preserve hesitation. It does not preserve the final conversations held around evening fires as families decide whether to remain or begin an uncertain journey toward unfamiliar lands. Those moments disappear with the people themselves. As smaller settlements empty larger towns absorb increasing numbers of newcomers. At first, this concentration strengthens urban centres. Additional workers help repair canals and construct new buildings. Markets become more active. Merchants benefit from larger populations. Religious festivals draw greater crowds than ever before. The cities appear vibrant. Beneath that appearance, however, pressure steadily increases. Food must now support more mouths. Water systems designed centuries earlier face demands their builders never anticipated. Waste accumulates more rapidly. Housing expands into areas once reserved for workshops or public spaces. The balance that once made these cities exceptionally well organized begins growing more difficult to maintain. Trade routes also become less predictable. Some caravans arrive weeks behind schedule. Others fail to appear altogether. Merchants returning from distant regions bring unsettling news. Communities once famous for surplus grain now seek food instead of selling it. Mountain passes become harder to cross after severe storms. River transport slows as water levels fluctuate unpredictably. The civilization's economic network, once one of its greatest strengths, begins transmitting hardship alongside opportunity. Problems in one region gradually spread into another. This interconnectedness had fueled centuries of prosperity. Now it amplifies instability. Archaeologists have identified another subtle clue from several ancient civilizations undergoing long-term stress. Craftsmanship changes. During prosperous periods, pottery is often carefully finished, standardized, and decorated with remarkable consistency. As pressures increase, production sometimes becomes faster but less refined. Decoration grows simpler. Repairs become more common than replacement. Objects remain functional, yet they reveal communities placing practicality above artistic refinement. This is not necessarily evidence of cultural decline. Rather, it reflects changing priorities. When harvests become uncertain, beauty yields to necessity. The same pattern appears in architecture. Public buildings once maintained with meticulous care begin showing signs of uneven repair. Walls are patched using whatever materials remain available. Road surfaces receive temporary rather than permanent maintenance. Older structures continue serving their purpose long after they would once have been rebuilt. Communities are conserving resources. Even religion may begin responding to changing circumstances. Throughout history, environmental uncertainty has often encouraged increased ritual activity. People seek meaning when familiar patterns disappear. Offerings become more frequent. Ceremonies emphasize fertility, rainfall, or protection. Sacred sites attract pilgrims hoping for reassurance during uncertain times. Unfortunately, archaeology can reveal the existence of these rituals more easily than their emotional significance. An offering buried beneath a temple floor cannot tell us whether it reflects gratitude, fear, hope, or desperation. It simply reminds us that ancient people confront uncertainty much as modern societies do. They search for explanations. They seek comfort. They adapt their traditions without fully understanding the forces reshaping their world. Meanwhile, the landscape continues changing. Rivers abandon old channels, leaving once thriving ports stranded far from dependable water. Floodplains gradually dry. In other regions, repeated flooding deposits thick layers of sediment across cultivated land, forcing farmers to clear fields year after year before planting. Wind erosion increases where forests have been cleared extensively for agriculture and fuel. Soils slowly lose nutrients accumulated over centuries. None of these changes is dramatic enough to dominate a single lifetime. Together they transform entire regions. Modern technologies allow researchers to reconstruct these environmental shifts with remarkable precision. Pollen trapped beneath ancient lake beds reveals changing vegetation. Tree rings preserve records of favorable and difficult growing seasons. Minerals deposited inside caves reflect long-term rainfall patterns. Microscopic charcoal particles indicate periods of increased burning. whether caused by human land management or expanding wildfires. These scientific records rarely tell identical stories across every region. Some communities experience worsening drought, others face greater flooding, still others remain relatively stable. The forgotten civilization is not collapsing everywhere at once. It is fragmenting. Some settlements continue thriving. Others shrink gradually. A few disappear almost entirely. This uneven pattern becomes one of the greatest challenges facing archaeologists. There is no single dramatic horizon marking the end. Instead, different communities respond differently according to local geography, available resources, and social connections. The civilization begins losing coherence. Its shared identity weakens as regions become increasingly focused on local survival. Trade grows less reliable. Communication slows. Generations raised under changing conditions gradually forget the confidence that once defined their ancestors. The world has not ended, but it has become smaller, more uncertain, more fragmented. The people cannot yet know that future archaeologists will look back upon this period as the beginning of one of history's most complete disappearances. To them, life simply demands more effort than it once did. Each harvest requires greater care. Each journey carries greater risk. Each year brings new adjustments. Without realizing it, they are already living through the slow unraveling of a civilization whose greatest achievement had always been its remarkable ability to hold countless communities together across an immense and carefully ordered landscape. There is no final proclamation. No messenger rides from city to city announcing that an age has come to an end. No army marches through every settlement leaving a clear line of destruction for future archaeologists to follow. Instead, the disappearance begins so quietly that those living through it almost certainly fail to recognize it as history. One family decides not to rebuild a damaged house. Another leaves after a disappointing harvest. A workshop closes because its owner has joined relatives in a more prosperous valley. Each decision is small, understandable, and deeply personal. Together they begin emptying an entire civilization. The first abandoned homes remain surrounded by occupied neighborhoods. Their roofs slowly collapse after years without maintenance. Rainwater seeps into mud brick walls. Wooden beams weaken beneath insects and moisture. Wind carries dust through doorways that once opened dozens of times each day. Children no longer play in nearby courtyards. Gardens become overgrown with grasses and shrubs. Neighbors continue living only a few steps away. For a time, these empty buildings seem temporary. Perhaps the owners will return after the next harvest. Perhaps relatives will inherit the property. Perhaps newcomers will settle there. Years pass. No one comes back. Archaeologists often find evidence of these gradual departures. Unlike cities destroyed by sudden catastrophe, abandoned settlements rarely contain large numbers of valuable possessions. People carry away what they can transport. Metal tools, livestock, stored food, woven textiles, family ornaments, and practical equipment disappear alongside their owners. What remains are broken pottery too damaged to justify moving heavy grinding stones, impossible to transport easily, and everyday objects of little value beyond the household that once used them. The pattern tells an important story. These people are not fleeing immediate disaster. They are making calculated choices. Migration unfolds over years, perhaps decades. Entire neighborhoods slowly empty rather than collapsing overnight. The streets reveal another subtle transformation. Paths once worn smooth by thousands of footsteps begin collecting wind-blown dust. Drainage channels fill with leaves, sediment, and debris because no one clears them before seasonal rains. Weeds emerge between paving stones. Small animals establish burrows beneath neglected walls. Nature advances cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as human activity retreats. Silence spreads unevenly. The busiest marketplaces remain active longer than residential districts. Administrative buildings may continue functioning after surrounding neighborhoods lose population. Religious centers still attract visitors even as nearby houses stand vacant. This uneven abandonment creates archaeological layers that can appear confusing. One part of a city continues thriving while another has already been reclaimed by time. Eventually, however, the balance shifts. Fewer merchants arrive from distant regions. Market stalls once crowded with imported goods offer increasingly local products. Specialized craftsmen lose customers as trade networks contract. Some abandon their professions altogether, returning to farming or following relatives toward more stable communities elsewhere. Economic complexity slowly begins unraveling. A civilization that once depends upon thousands of interconnected relationships becomes increasingly localized. Communities focus on immediate survival instead of long-distance cooperation. This change leaves surprisingly clear evidence. Materials that once traveled hundreds of kilometers become increasingly rare. Decorative styles grow more regional. Standardized manufacturing gives way to local variation. Trade does not disappear entirely, but it no longer binds distant populations into a unified cultural world. Political organization almost certainly changes as well. Unfortunately, this is one of the most difficult aspects to reconstruct. Without surviving written records, archaeologists must infer shifts in authority from settlement patterns and material remains. Large administrative centers appear to lose influence. Smaller regional communities become more independent. Public construction projects become less ambitious. Maintenance replaces expansion. Repair replaces innovation. The civilization is no longer growing. It is conserving. Even the cemeteries tell a quieter story. Some burial grounds continue receiving new graves while nearby settlements shrink dramatically. Others cease being used altogether. Generations who once expected to rest beside their ancestors are instead buried in unfamiliar landscapes after migration. Family histories become scattered across widening distances. The emotional consequences of these changes remain invisible in the archaeological record. A broken wall cannot reveal grief. An abandoned house cannot preserve longing. A silent street cannot explain whether its former residents leave with hope, fear, or reluctant acceptance. Yet those emotions almost certainly accompany every departure. People rarely abandon successful lives willingly. Something important has changed. Modern scientific techniques continue revealing additional clues. Sediment accumulating inside abandoned canals indicates how quickly maintenance ends after communities depart. Animal bones show shifts in livestock management as herding replaces intensive agriculture in some regions. Ancient pollen records reveal cultivated fields gradually returning to wild vegetation. Trees begin reclaiming cleared land where farming has ceased. Nature wastes little time. Within a generation, neglected fields fill with shrubs. Within several generations, young forests may obscure the outlines of former villages. Riverbanks erode abandoned docks. Floods deposit fresh layers of sediment across deserted streets. Wind carries fine dust into roofless buildings year after year. The landscape begins erasing human geometry. Roads disappear first. Without constant travel, vegetation softens their edges until they resemble ordinary ground. Canals follow. Their carefully engineered banks collapse into shallow depressions almost indistinguishable from natural waterways. Walls gradually sink beneath accumulated soil. Only stone foundations survive long enough to hint that buildings once stood there. One particularly striking feature appears across several abandoned settlements. There is remarkably little evidence of widespread violence. Some communities certainly experience conflict. Human history has never been entirely peaceful. Weapons, defensive walls, and occasional skeletal injuries confirm that warfare exists. Yet many settlements show no signs of burning massacre or chaotic destruction. Instead, they simply become empty. This distinction matters. Popular imagination often seeks dramatic endings. Invading armies, great battles, sudden catastrophes. Reality is frequently quieter. Entire civilizations may dissolve through countless individual decisions rather than one overwhelming event. Scholars still debate the precise balance between environmental change, economic disruption, migration, political transformation, and social adaptation. No single explanation fully accounts for every abandoned settlement. Different regions almost certainly follow different paths. Some suffer prolonged drought, others lose access to crucial trade routes. Some merge peacefully with neighbouring cultures, others fragment into smaller independent societies. The disappearance is not a single story. It is thousands of stories unfolding simultaneously. Children born during these years grow up in a fundamentally different world from the one their grandparents know. They inherit fewer shared traditions connecting distant communities. Travel becomes less common. Regional identities strengthen while broader cultural unity weakens. Languages begin changing independently as communication declines. Songs, rituals, and local customs evolve along separate paths. Without realizing it, these generations are witnessing the gradual transformation of one civilization into many smaller societies. History often mistakes this process for disappearance. The people themselves do not vanish. They marry, raise children, plant crops, build homes, celebrate seasonal festivals, mourn their dead. Life continues. Only the civilization, the vast network binding countless communities into a common identity, slowly dissolves. Centuries later, travelers crossing these abandoned landscapes encounter scattered ruins, whose builders have long since been forgotten. Without written histories explaining what once existed, myths begin replacing memory. Ancient walls become the work of legendary giants. Old canals are attributed to heroes whose names change with every generation. The true origins of abandoned cities fade beyond living recollection. By the time written civilizations describe these regions, the great network that once connected them has already disappeared from cultural memory. The silence becomes complete. Not because every person dies, not because every building collapses at once, but because the chain of remembrance itself has finally broken. The civilization that once seemed permanent has passed into anonymity, leaving behind only buried foundations, scattered artifacts, and landscapes that still carry the faint outlines of human ambition beneath centuries of soil, grass, and quiet forgetting. For centuries after the last families leave, the cities remain where they have always stood. Their streets do not vanish overnight. Their walls do not immediately crumble into dust. Empty buildings continue casting shadows across silent courtyards long after the voices that once filled them have faded away. Time, however, possesses a patience greater than any empire. What human hands construct over hundreds of years, wind, rain, roots, rivers, and gravity slowly reclaim over hundreds more. The first visitors to these abandoned settlements are not archaeologists. They are shepherds searching for grazing land, hunters following migrating animals, traders taking unfamiliar shortcuts, and travellers seeking shelter before nightfall. To them, the empty cities are already ancient. No one remembers who built them. No one can explain why they stand deserted. Their silence invites imagination. A roofless hall becomes the palace of a forgotten king. A collapsed temple becomes the dwelling place of powerful spirits. Massive stone walls inspire stories of giants whose strength exceeds ordinary human understanding. Children growing up in nearby villages hear tales connecting these ruins to mythical ancestors rather than real historical communities. This transformation from history into legend is one of the final stages of disappearance. Memory survives, accuracy does not. Across generations, every retelling alters the story slightly. Practical details disappear first. Names of rivers change. Old trade routes are forgotten. The purposes of unusual buildings become mysterious. Eventually, even the civilization itself dissolves into folklore, its achievements preserved only as fragments woven into local traditions. Meanwhile, nature continues its slow work. Seeds carried by birds settle inside abandoned courtyards. Grass spreads across neglected streets. Small shrubs take root in cracks between stones. As decades pass, larger trees establish themselves where homes once stood. Their roots force apart carefully fitted masonry, widening every tiny fracture created by changing seasons. Each winter allows moisture to seep deeper into the stone. Each summer expands those cracks a little farther. No single season destroys a building. Thousands of seasons eventually do. In regions with heavy rainfall, roofs collapse first. Without protection from the elements, interior walls weaken rapidly. Clay bricks dissolve back into earth from which they were originally formed. Wooden beams rot until entire ceilings fall inward, burying household objects beneath layers of debris. These collapsed buildings become accidental time capsules. Rooms sealed beneath fallen roofs often preserve everyday objects exactly where they are left. Grinding stones remain beside food preparation areas. Broken pottery lies scattered across ancient floors. Small tools disappear beneath dust carried through shattered doorways year after year. Elsewhere, different environments create different forms of preservation. In arid landscapes, dry conditions slow decay dramatically. Mud brick walls survive much longer than expected. Organic materials that would quickly disappear in wetter climates remain intact for centuries. Fragments of woven baskets, wooden tools, and plant fibers provide extraordinary glimpses into ordinary lives. Floodplains tell another story. Abandoned settlements beside rivers gradually disappear beneath repeated deposits of silt. Each flood leaves behind another thin layer of sediment. After centuries, entire neighborhoods may lie several meters below the modern ground surface. To later generations, nothing suggests a city ever occupied the location. Only subtle changes in soil color or slight rises in the landscape hint at what rests below. Coastal settlements face an entirely different fate. As sea levels continue changing after the end of the Ice Age, some ancient communities are gradually submerged. Storms reshape shorelines. River mouths shift. Harbors become marshes. In certain regions, buildings that once overlook fertile plains eventually lie beneath shallow water, hidden beneath layers of sand and marine sediment. These drowned landscapes remain invisible until modern underwater archaeology begins exploring them thousands of years later. The civilization is disappearing twice, first from human memory, then from the physical landscape itself. Animals quietly reclaim spaces once dominated by people. Foxes establish dens beneath abandoned foundations. Birds nest inside roofless buildings. Deer wander through former marketplaces. Beavers alter waterways carefully engineered by generations of ancient laborers. The distinction between natural and human environments becomes increasingly blurred. Eventually, forests conceal entire cities. From ground-level travelers pass only meters away from buried streets without recognizing them. Dense vegetation masks walls beneath tangled roots and fallen leaves. Even substantial structures become nearly impossible to identify, once centuries of organic growth accumulate above them. Deserts preserve a different illusion. Wind gradually buries abandoned settlements beneath drifting sand. One season deposits only a thin layer. The next adds another. Century after century, dunes migrate across forgotten buildings until only the highest walls remain visible. Later travelers mistake these isolated ruins for the remnants of much smaller settlements, because nearly everything else has disappeared beneath the desert. Volcanic regions occasionally produce even more remarkable preservation. Though catastrophic for those living nearby, volcanic ash can seal entire landscapes with extraordinary speed. Buildings, roads, tools, seeds, and footprints become protected beneath layers that isolate them from later disturbance. Such preservation is rare, however. The civilization under consideration leaves behind no single dramatic disaster explaining its disappearance. Instead, countless ordinary natural processes combine over immense spans of time. Archaeologists sometimes describe this as the archaeology of absence. What survives is shaped not only by what ancient people build, but by everything that happens afterward. Two neighboring settlements abandoned during the same decade may leave completely different archaeological records depending on soil chemistry, rainfall, vegetation, earthquakes, or later human activity. This makes reconstruction extraordinarily difficult. Imagine attempting to understand an entire modern nation after discovering only scattered neighborhoods separated by hundreds of kilometers, with most documents destroyed and many buildings missing entirely. That challenge resembles the work facing archaeologists studying civilizations that vanish without written histories. Every discovery raises new possibilities. It also introduces new uncertainties. A well-preserved workshop reveals sophisticated manufacturing techniques. But where are the craftsmen buried? A carefully planned street grid demonstrates remarkable urban organization. Who oversees its construction? Large storage buildings suggest administrative coordination. How are resources distributed? Without surviving texts, every answer must emerge from physical evidence alone. Scholars therefore proceed cautiously. What survives in the record suggests impressive social organization. The evidence also remains incomplete. No single excavation can reconstruct an entire civilization. Only decades of patient research across multiple regions gradually reveal larger patterns hidden beneath isolated discoveries. Centuries continue passing. New civilizations rise nearby. Their merchants occasionally reuse stones from abandoned buildings. Farmers unknowingly plow across ancient foundations. Roads follow routes first established thousands of years earlier because geography continues favoring the same crossings, valleys, and riverbanks. The forgotten civilization quietly influences later societies even as its identity disappears. People live above its buried streets without recognizing them. Children play where marketplaces once bustle with trade. Temples dedicated to new beliefs stand upon foundations laid by builders whose names have long since vanished. The landscape remembers continuity that human memory has lost. By the beginning of the modern age, the civilization has become almost completely invisible. Its cities appear as low mounds scattered across fields. Its canals resemble natural depressions. Its roads survive only as faint lines detectable under certain lighting conditions. Most people pass these places without a second glance. The disappearance seems complete. Yet beneath those quiet hills, beneath ordinary farmland and forgotten deserts, beneath forests and floodplains, millions of artifacts still wait exactly where they have rested for thousands of years. They are silent, but they are not gone. They are waiting for someone to ask the right questions and for science to develop the tools capable of hearing stories that history itself forgets to tell. For most of human history, the forgotten civilization remains exactly where it has always been hidden, not because it lies impossibly deep beneath the earth, but because no one recognizes what they are looking at. A low hill in the middle of a field appears entirely natural. A line of unusually fertile soil seems like an ordinary feature of the landscape. Broken fragments of pottery collected by farmers are treated as little more than curious stones. The greatest challenge is not that the evidence disappears. It is that the evidence blends so completely into the world around it that generations walk across it without noticing. The rediscovery begins almost by accident. A farmer preparing a field strikes an unusually straight wall buried just beneath the surface. Builders digging foundations for a new structure uncover rows of ancient bricks, unlike anything used in the surrounding villages. Heavy rains wash away part of a riverbank, exposing pottery, stone tools, and human burials that have remained untouched for thousands of years. At first, these discoveries seem isolated. One forgotten settlement, one abandoned cemetery, one unusual collection of artifacts. No one yet imagines they belong to an immense civilization stretching across vast regions. The earliest excavations are often limited by the knowledge of their time. 19th and early 20th century archaeologists possess remarkable determination, but comparatively simple tools. Excavation frequently focuses on recovering impressive objects rather than understanding entire landscapes. Decorative pottery, finely crafted ornaments, and unusual sculptures receive careful attention, while ordinary houses refuse pits, irrigation channels, and agricultural fields may be overlooked. Yet even these early discoveries begin raising difficult questions. The craftsmanship is unexpectedly sophisticated. The settlements are larger than anticipated. The planning appears deliberate rather than accidental. Most puzzling of all, there are simply too many sites. As decades pass, archaeological methods improve dramatically. Researchers begin recording not only spectacular artifacts, but also the precise location of every object, every wall, every layer of soil. Tiny fragments once dismissed as insignificant become valuable sources of information. Animal bones reveal changing diets. Burned seeds identify cultivated crops. Charcoal provides material for radiocarbon dating. Even microscopic traces preserved within ancient sediments begin contributing to the larger story. The civilization slowly emerges from thousands of individual discoveries. One excavation uncovers an elaborate drainage system. Another reveals carefully planned streets. A third identifies workshops producing standardized tools. Elsewhere, archaeologists find extensive granaries capable of storing enormous quantities of food. Individually, these discoveries are impressive. Together, they reveal something extraordinary. This is not a loose collection of unrelated villages. It is a highly organized cultural world extending far beyond the boundaries of any single excavation. Mapping becomes one of archaeology's most powerful tools. As surveys expand across neighboring regions, researchers notice remarkable patterns. Settlements appear at regular intervals along rivers. Roads connect communities separated by dozens of kilometers. Ceramic styles remain consistent across enormous territories. Construction methods display striking similarities despite considerable geographical distances. The civilization is revealing its outline. Then technology transforms archaeology once again. Aerial photography allows researchers to see landscapes from perspectives impossible at ground level. Fields that appear perfectly ordinary suddenly reveal buried streets visible only through subtle differences in crop growth. Ancient walls affect soil moisture just enough for plants growing above them to mature differently from surrounding vegetation. These faint patterns become visible from the air like invisible ink slowly appearing upon paper. Entire cities emerge without turning a single shovel. Satellite imagery expands these possibilities even further. High-resolution images reveal forgotten canals stretching across deserts. Ancient road networks become visible beneath modern farmland. Long-buried building foundations create slight variations in temperature detectable from space. What once required decades of field exploration can now be identified across hundreds of square kilometers within weeks. Even then, surprises continue. Remote sensing technologies reveal settlements hidden beneath dense forests where excavation would be extraordinarily difficult. Some sites lie beneath modern cities, preserved below centuries of continuous occupation. Others remain concealed beneath floodplains where rivers have deposited several meters of sediment since antiquity. The civilization proves far larger than anyone initially suspects. One particularly revolutionary technique changes understanding almost overnight: ground-penetrating radar. Without disturbing the soil, researchers send electromagnetic signals into the earth and record reflections produced by buried structures. Walls, roads, foundations, wells, and even individual rooms begin appearing as detailed underground maps. Archaeologists can now visualize entire neighborhoods before excavation begins. It is as though invisible cities gradually rise from beneath the landscape. Another innovation follows: LIDAR, or light detection and ranging. Mounted aboard aircraft, laser pulses penetrate gaps in forest canopies and measure the ground beneath with astonishing precision. Dense vegetation that once concealed ancient settlements becomes almost irrelevant. Digital models strip away trees, revealing terraces, roads, reservoirs, defensive walls, canals, and city layouts invisible to anyone standing below. Around the world, LIDAR repeatedly demonstrates that archaeologists have underestimated the scale of ancient civilizations. The forgotten civilization is no exception. Every new survey discovers additional settlements. Previously isolated archaeological sites become connected pieces of an immense network. The silence left by history begins filling with evidence. Laboratory science contributes equally important discoveries. Radiocarbon dating establishes increasingly precise chronologies. Stable isotope analysis reveals ancient diets and patterns of migration. Chemical examination identifies the geographical origin of metal, stone, and ceramics. DNA extracted from human remains provides insights into population movement, family relationships, and long-term genetic continuity. The picture becomes richer each year, yet every answer produces new questions. Why are so many settlements abandoned gradually rather than violently? Why do some regions remain occupied longer than others? Why does material culture evolve differently after the civilization fragments? Most importantly, where do the people go? Ancient DNA offers part of the answer. In many cases, descendants do not disappear. Their genetic signatures continue appearing among later populations living in neighboring regions. This finding fundamentally changes how historians think about collapse. Civilizations may vanish. People often survive. Cultural identities transform. Languages evolve. Political systems dissolve. Families continue living. The disappearance is social rather than biological. Another line of evidence comes from environmental science. Sediment cores extracted from lakes preserve thousands of years of pollen, microscopic organisms, and mineral deposits. These records reconstruct changing climates with extraordinary detail. Periods of prolonged drought become visible. Shifts in vegetation reveal expanding grasslands or retreating forests. Flood frequencies can be estimated from changing sediment layers. For the first time, archaeologists compare environmental changes directly with patterns of settlement abandonment. The results are compelling. Environmental stress clearly influences many regions, but it explains only part of the story. Some communities survive difficult climates remarkably well. Others decline despite relatively favorable environmental conditions. Scholars still debate exactly why. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. The forgotten civilization becomes even more fascinating precisely because it refuses to fit simple narratives. There is no lone villain, no singular catastrophe, no dramatic final battle. Instead, archaeology uncovers an intricate story of adaptation, resilience, migration, environmental change, economic transformation, and cultural evolution unfolding across centuries. Perhaps the most remarkable realization emerges from the ordinary objects left behind. A child's clay toy, a worn grinding stone, a cracked cooking vessel repaired several times before finally being discarded. Footprints preserved in drying mud beside an irrigation canal. These artifacts remind modern researchers that civilizations are not abstract historical forces. They are millions of individual lives. Each object belonged to someone who expected tomorrow to resemble today. Someone who repaired tools, planted crops, celebrated festivals, worried about family, and probably never imagined that thousands of years later, strangers would carefully uncover the traces of those ordinary moments. The civilization did not leave magnificent inscriptions announcing its achievements. Instead, it left something perhaps even more powerful, evidence of everyday humanity. And through the patient work of archaeology, those quiet traces are beginning to speak once more after remaining silent beneath the earth for millennia. As archaeologists uncover more settlements and scientists gather more environmental and genetic evidence, one conclusion becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The civilization may have disappeared from history, but it did not disappear from humanity. The people themselves almost certainly continue living, carrying with them skills, beliefs, technologies, and memories that quietly flow into the cultures that follow. The greatest mystery is no longer whether they survive. It is how much of their world remains hidden inside later civilizations without ever being recognized. History often encourages the illusion that civilizations replace one another cleanly. One empire falls, another rises. One people vanish, another arrives. The archaeological record tells a far more complicated story. Human societies rarely begin from nothing. They inherit landscapes shaped by earlier generations, roads already carved across mountains, irrigation systems already directing rivers and fields, cultivated for centuries before new rulers appear. Even when political systems collapse, practical knowledge usually survives because it remains essential for daily life. A farmer does not abandon an effective method of growing crops simply because the government changes. A potter continues using reliable firing techniques regardless of shifting political boundaries. Builders preserve construction methods that have proven successful through generations of experience. The civilization may lose its shared identity, but countless fragments of its knowledge continue traveling forward through ordinary people. This quiet inheritance is surprisingly difficult to detect. Written history naturally favors kings' wars, treaties, and dynasties. It rarely records the transmission of practical skills between neighboring villages, yet archaeology repeatedly reveals remarkable continuity beneath apparent political change. Settlements abandoned during one cultural phase are often reoccupied centuries later. The newcomers modify existing buildings rather than constructing entirely new ones. Ancient wells continue supplying fresh water. Old roads remain the easiest routes across difficult terrain. Irrigation canals dug by forgotten engineers continue carrying rivers toward fertile fields. The landscape itself preserves memory. Generations may forget who first created these systems, but they continue using them because they work. One of the clearest examples comes from agriculture. Pollen preserved within ancient sediments reveals that many cultivated plants remain important long after the civilization itself has fragmented. Crop varieties refined over centuries continue feeding later populations. Knowledge of local soil, seasonal weather, and water management survives because abandoning it would make survival far more difficult. Seeds become silent messengers between civilizations. The same continuity appears in craftsmanship. Pottery styles certainly evolve, but close examination often reveals techniques passed almost unchanged across hundreds of years. Clay preparation, firing temperatures, decorative methods, and manufacturing sequences sometimes outlast the societies that originally developed them. Master craftsmen teach apprentices. Those apprentices teach another generation. Political identities shift while technical knowledge quietly endures. Language presents a more difficult puzzle. Without extensive written records, reconstructing ancient speech remains extraordinarily challenging. Scholars compare place names, surviving inscriptions from neighboring cultures, and patterns among later languages, seeking faint echoes of older linguistic traditions. Occasionally, ancient river names or mountain names survive astonishingly long. Unlike cities, rivers rarely move far from their established courses. Communities settling nearby often adopt existing names rather than inventing new ones. These linguistic fossils may preserve traces of forgotten populations long after every other aspect of their identity has changed. Religion also carries surprising continuity. Sacred landscapes possess remarkable persistence throughout history. A hill regarded as spiritually important by one civilization frequently remains sacred to those arriving centuries later. Springs, caves, unusual rock formations, and prominent mountain peaks often continue attracting ritual activity despite changing beliefs. The meaning evolves. The location remains. Archaeologists frequently uncover temples built directly upon older ceremonial sites. Each generation reshapes the architecture according to its own traditions, while unconsciously preserving places already considered significant by countless ancestors. The result resembles layers of memory accumulating across thousands of years. Modern genetic research adds another dimension to this story. Ancient DNA recovered from carefully preserved human remains allows scientists to compare prehistoric populations with later communities. The results repeatedly challenge older assumptions about complete replacement. In many regions, substantial genetic continuity exists despite enormous cultural transformation. New populations certainly arrive. Migration has always shaped human history. but incoming groups often mix with local communities rather than eliminating them entirely. The descendants carry ancestry from multiple civilizations simultaneously. This finding changes the meaning of disappearance. The civilization is not erased. It is absorbed. Its people become part of something new. Children grow up speaking different languages while inheriting the genes of forgotten ancestors. New religions emerge upon ancient foundations. Fresh political identities replace older ones. Generation after generation, memory shifts until no one recognizes how much of the past survives within the present. Trade networks leave equally enduring legacies. Roots established by the forgotten civilization often remain important for thousands of years because geography rarely changes. Mountain passes continue providing the easiest crossings. River valleys remain natural transportation corridors. Harbors still offer safe anchorage. Later merchants unknowingly follow roads first cleared by people whose names have long vanished from memory. Cities frequently arise where older settlements once flourish. This pattern appears across much of the ancient world. Modern towns stand above Roman settlements. Roman settlements often occupy older Iron Age communities. Those communities themselves may rest upon Bronze Age villages. Each civilization inherits advantages discovered by previous inhabitants. The result is remarkable continuity hidden beneath apparent change. Even myths may preserve distorted memories of forgotten societies. Folklore often contains stories of mysterious builders, vanished kingdoms, or ancient peoples possessing extraordinary knowledge. Such tales cannot be accepted as literal history. They evolve continuously through oral tradition. Yet scholars occasionally wonder whether some legends preserve faint echoes of genuine historical events, transformed through centuries of retelling. The evidence remains uncertain. No single explanation fully accounts for the relationship between myth and archaeology. Still, the persistence of certain stories reminds us that human memory sometimes outlives factual accuracy. A forgotten civilization may survive first as history, then as legend, finally as little more than an unexplained feeling that someone important once occupied the landscape. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies not in objects but in ways of thinking. The civilization develops practical solutions to environmental challenges through centuries of careful observation. Knowledge about irrigation, crop management, settlement planning, seasonal timing, and resource conservation accumulates slowly across generations. Later societies inherit many of these practices without necessarily understanding their full origins. Wisdom becomes anonymous. It no longer belongs to identifiable individuals or even recognizable civilizations. It simply becomes tradition. Modern archaeologists increasingly appreciate this invisible inheritance. Earlier generations often focused upon spectacular monuments because they appeared to define civilization. Today, researchers recognize that ordinary systems supporting daily life may represent even greater achievements. Reliable sanitation, efficient water management, adaptable agriculture, cooperative trade. These innovations allow millions of people to flourish for centuries without requiring constant military expansion or monumental construction. Ironically, their very practicality makes them easier to overlook. Grand palaces attract attention. Drainage systems disappear beneath streets. Kings leave inscriptions. Farmers leave fertile fields. History remembers the dramatic. Archaeology patiently uncovers the ordinary. The forgotten civilization forces scholars to reconsider what truly deserves remembrance. Perhaps greatness is not measured only by enormous monuments or famous rulers. Perhaps it also exists in communities capable of sustaining peaceful cooperation across immense landscapes for generations. Perhaps the most extraordinary achievement is creating a society so well adapted to its environment that everyday life becomes stable enough for millions of ordinary moments to unfold almost unnoticed. Those moments rarely appear in textbooks. Yet they form the substance of civilization itself. Children learning from parents, neighbors repairing canals together, merchants greeting familiar trading partners, farmers reading the changing sky before planting seeds. These quiet activities connect ancient people to every generation that follows. The civilization without a surviving name may never recover its lost identity completely. Its language may remain silent. Its rulers may remain unknown. Its disappearance may never receive a single definitive explanation, yet its influence continues flowing beneath history like an underground river nourishing later cultures that seldom realize how deeply their roots reach into a forgotten world whose greatest legacy is not that it vanished, but that so much of it quietly endured. Even after more than a century of excavation, the forgotten civilization continues refusing to surrender all of its secrets. Every archaeological season answers one question only to create several new ones. A newly discovered settlement expands the known boundaries of the culture, but it also forces researchers to explain why nearby regions remain almost empty. A sophisticated drainage system demonstrates remarkable engineering ability, yet no surviving document explains who organized its construction. The deeper scholars investigate, the clearer it becomes that the greatest mystery is not simply what has been found, but how much still lies hidden beneath the modern world. Archaeology has changed profoundly since the first excavations. Earlier researchers often concentrated on spectacular locations, believing that the largest cities alone could explain an ancient civilization. Modern archaeology approaches the landscape very differently. Every abandoned farm, every isolated well, every refuse pit, and every forgotten pathway contributes another piece to a far larger puzzle. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries appear almost insignificant. A handful of burned seeds reveals which crops farmers cultivate during periods of environmental stress. Animal dung preserved within ancient soil identifies livestock management practices impossible to observe directly. Microscopic grains of starch trapped inside grinding stones reveal foods consumed thousands of years ago. Residue clinging to the interior of broken pottery preserves traces of milk oils, fermented beverages, or cooked grains long after the meals themselves disappear. The civilization gradually becomes visible through details its people never intend to preserve. One of archaeology's greatest strengths is its ability to reconstruct ordinary life. Royal inscriptions, where they exist, usually celebrate victories and rulers. Refuse dumps tell a different story. Discarded fish bones reveal changing diets. Broken tools expose patterns of daily labor. Fragments of woven baskets indicate methods of transporting crops. Even household rubbish provides extraordinary insight into how people actually live rather than how elites wish to be remembered. This shift in perspective transforms understanding of the forgotten civilization. Instead of searching only for kings or monumental architecture, researchers increasingly ask different questions. How much water does each settlement consume? Where do children play? How are neighborhoods organized? What kinds of food become more common over time? How far does an ordinary person travel during a lifetime? These questions rarely produce dramatic headlines. They produce something far more valuable, a realistic picture of ancient humanity. Scientific collaboration has become essential. No single archaeologist can interpret every clue. Geologists reconstruct ancient river systems. Botanists identify preserved plant remains. Zoologists examine animal bones. Chemists analyze mineral composition. Climate scientists compare archaeological evidence with long-term environmental records. Geneticists recover DNA from ancient skeletons. Computer specialists build digital reconstructions of settlements buried beneath modern landscapes. The forgotten civilization emerges through the combined work of dozens of disciplines rather than a single field of study. Digital technology accelerates this process enormously. Three-dimensional scanning allows fragile artifacts to be studied without repeated handling. Entire excavation sites can be reconstructed, virtually preserving every layer before additional digging begins. Researchers separated by thousands of kilometers examine identical digital models, simultaneously comparing interpretations without risking damage to irreplaceable evidence. Artificial intelligence increasingly assists this work. Machine learning systems analyze enormous collections of pottery fragments, identifying subtle manufacturing patterns that might escape human observation. Algorithms compare satellite imagery across vast regions, detecting faint traces of buried structures invisible to the naked eye. Computers process millions of environmental measurements, helping scientists identify relationships between climate settlement growth and abandonment. These technologies do not replace archaeologists. They extend human perception. Patterns once hidden within overwhelming quantities of information gradually become visible. Yet despite these remarkable advances, uncertainty remains at the heart of historical research. Consider one abandoned city. Its streets are carefully planned. Its drainage system functions efficiently. Its workshops produce standardized goods. Then over several generations, the population declines. Why? One explanation points toward changing rainfall. Another emphasizes weakening trade. A third suggests shifting political alliances. A fourth argues that migration simply redistributes the population into neighboring regions. Each hypothesis explains part of the evidence. None explains everything. This willingness to accept uncertainty distinguishes responsible archaeology from sensational speculation. Popular culture often prefers dramatic answers. Lost super-civilizations, mysterious advanced technologies, sudden unexplained disasters, hidden knowledge deliberately suppressed. Such stories are entertaining, but they rarely withstand careful examination. The forgotten civilization does not require extraordinary myths to be fascinating. Its real history is already remarkable. Millions of people organize sophisticated communities without leaving extensive written records. They manage water across enormous landscapes. They sustain long-distance trade. They adapt repeatedly to environmental challenges. Then over centuries they gradually transform into something different. Reality proves more complex than fiction. It also proves more human. Another important lesson emerges from ongoing research. Ancient civilizations are rarely as isolated as once believed. The forgotten society exchanges goods with neighboring cultures. Ideas move across mountains, rivers, and deserts. Technologies spread through peaceful contact as well as migration. Archaeologists increasingly reject older models portraying civilizations as sealed worlds developing independently. Instead, they recognize immense networks of interaction connecting diverse peoples across surprising distances. This interconnectedness complicates every attempt to define where one civilization truly ends and another begins. Cultures overlap, traditions blend, communities borrow successful ideas from neighbors. Identity remains fluid rather than fixed. Perhaps that fluidity itself contributes to the civilization's apparent disappearance. If people gradually adopt new customs while preserving older practices, when exactly does one civilization become another? The answer may depend more upon modern categories than ancient reality. People living through those generations probably do not perceive themselves as participating in historical transitions. They simply adapt to changing circumstances. Children learn slightly different traditions than their parents. Communities develop new political relationships. Trade routes shift. Religious ceremonies evolve. Language changes one generation at a time. No clear boundary separates old from new. The transformation resembles the slow changing of a river rather than the collapse of a bridge. This realization has profound implications. History often searches for endings. Archaeology frequently discovers continuities. The civilization does not vanish like smoke. It disperses like seeds carried by the wind. Some fall nearby, others travel great distances. Each takes root under different conditions. Centuries later, their common origin becomes almost impossible to recognize. Even today, enormous portions of the civilization almost certainly remain undiscovered. Modern cities stand above ancient settlements. Farmland conceals buried villages. Deserts hide roads beneath drifting sand. Forests continue protecting forgotten structures beneath dense vegetation. Rising seas cover coastal communities that may never be excavated completely. Every year brings new discoveries. Every discovery reminds researchers how incomplete the current picture remains. There is humility in this work. The archaeologist brushes away a few centimeters of soil, knowing that thousands of years lie beneath. Each artifact recovered represents only a tiny fraction of what once existed. For every carefully excavated settlement, countless others remain untouched. For every answered question, several more emerge from the earth. The forgotten civilization continues teaching an unexpected lesson. History is not a finished book. It is an unfinished excavation. Every generation asks new questions of old evidence. Improved technologies reveal details previously invisible. Fresh discoveries reshape long-held assumptions. The past itself does not change. Our understanding of it never stops evolving. And somewhere beneath ordinary fields, beneath forests, deserts, rivers, and modern towns, countless silent witnesses still wait in darkness, preserving pieces of a civilization that once believed, as every civilization does, that its place in the world would endure far longer than time ultimately allowed. The mystery surrounding the vanished civilization has inspired countless theories, ranging from careful scientific explanations to extraordinary claims that capture public imagination. Whenever history leaves gaps in the record, speculation naturally rushes in to fill them. Empty cities become evidence of forgotten empires with impossible technologies. Missing names encourage stories about civilizations deliberately erased from history. Ordinary archaeological puzzles are transformed into tales of supernatural disappearances, lost continents, or visitors from distant worlds. The real challenge is learning how to separate genuine mystery from attractive fiction, without losing the sense of wonder that first draws people toward the past. One of the oldest explanations is also the simplest. An invading army arrives. Cities are destroyed. The population is either killed or driven away. For many ancient civilizations, warfare undeniably plays a major role in political change. Archaeologists frequently uncover burned buildings, defensive fortifications, hastily repaired weapons embedded in walls, and skeletons bearing unmistakable signs of violent death. The forgotten civilization, however, tells a different story. Violence certainly exists. No society remains entirely free from conflict. Yet across many major settlements, widespread evidence for catastrophic military conquest remains surprisingly limited. Most cities do not end beneath thick layers of ash. Many buildings are not violently destroyed. Instead, occupation gradually declines before abandonment. This does not eliminate warfare as one contributing factor. Regional conflicts almost certainly occur. Some communities may indeed suffer attacks, but no single military campaign adequately explains the disappearance across such an immense geographical area. Another popular explanation focuses entirely upon climate. Long-term drought, changing river systems, declining agricultural productivity. Environmental science provides compelling evidence that significant climatic fluctuations affect many ancient societies. Tree rings cave deposits, lake sediments, and pollen records all point toward periods of environmental stress, overlapping with phases of settlement decline. Yet climate alone cannot solve the puzzle. Several communities survive under remarkably difficult environmental conditions. Others decline despite relatively stable local climates. Human societies rarely respond identically to similar challenges. Leadership, cooperation, trade, technology, and geography all influence resilience. Climate shapes possibilities. It does not determine destiny. Disease presents another possibility. Dense populations, expanding trade, and close contact with domesticated animals create favorable conditions for epidemics. History contains numerous examples of diseases reshaping entire civilizations. Unfortunately, proving ancient epidemics is extraordinarily difficult. Human remains rarely preserve direct evidence of infectious illnesses unless exceptional preservation occurs. DNA from ancient pathogens is sometimes recoverable, but such discoveries remain relatively rare. At present, scholars have found no convincing evidence for a single devastating epidemic capable of explaining the civilization's widespread transformation. Disease may contribute. It does not appear to provide the complete answer. Economic decline offers a more gradual explanation. Trade networks flourish during periods of stability. They become increasingly fragile when environmental changes, regional conflicts, or population shifts interrupt long-established connections. Communities specializing in craftsmanship depend upon reliable exchanges for raw materials and customers. If those networks weaken over generations, economic opportunities diminish. Families relocate. Urban populations shrink. Local production replaces specialized manufacturing. The civilization slowly fragments without requiring dramatic catastrophe. This interpretation fits much of the archaeological evidence remarkably well. Still, it leaves important questions unanswered. Why do some trade routes survive while others disappear? Why do certain cities adapt successfully whereas neighboring settlements are abandoned? Again, no single explanation proves sufficient. Popular culture often introduces far more dramatic possibilities. One recurring claim suggests that the civilization possesses advanced technologies beyond anything accepted by mainstream archaeology. Massive stone structures, sophisticated engineering, or precise urban planning are sometimes presented as evidence of lost scientific knowledge, impossible for ancient people to achieve. This argument dramatically underestimates ancient humanity. The engineering accomplishments uncovered through archaeology are indeed extraordinary, but they remain entirely consistent with technologies available at the time. Generations of skilled craftsmen, organized labor, careful observation, and accumulated practical experience explain these achievements without requiring mysterious inventions. Ancient people deserve credit for their genuine accomplishments rather than fictional ones. Another enduring myth proposes deliberate suppression. According to this idea, historians or governments intentionally hide evidence of forgotten civilizations. The reality is almost exactly the opposite. Archaeologists actively search for new discoveries because each one advances understanding of human history. Excavations are published. Artifacts are studied openly. Scientific debate occurs precisely because evidence is incomplete, not because it is concealed. Disagreements among scholars reflect honest attempts to interpret complicated data rather than organized secrecy. Perhaps the most famous speculative theories involve lost continents or vanished super-civilizations. Stories inspired by legendary places such as Atlantis frequently become attached to any archaeological mystery. A sophisticated civilization disappears. Therefore, some conclude it must belong to a forgotten global empire destroyed by sudden catastrophe. The archaeological evidence does not support this conclusion. The forgotten civilization is remarkable enough without placing it within unsupported legends. Its achievements arise through gradual cultural development spanning centuries. Its disappearance unfolds over equally long periods. Reality lacks the dramatic simplicity of myth. It possesses something richer, complexity. There is another reason extraordinary theories remain attractive. People naturally seek clear endings. They prefer dramatic turning points to slow transformation. A civilization swallowed overnight by the sea creates a memorable story. A civilization gradually adapting, fragmenting, migrating, and evolving across several centuries demands greater patience. Yet patience is exactly what archaeology teaches. Time works differently than human imagination prefers. The forgotten civilization does not vanish in an instant. It changes generation by generation until later observers no longer recognize its descendants as belonging to the same cultural tradition. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding involves the very word disappearance. It suggests absence, extinction, complete erasure. The archaeological record increasingly argues for a different interpretation. Transformation. Communities relocate. Political structures dissolve. Languages evolve. Trade networks shift. Religious practices change. Children grow into adults under different circumstances than those experienced by their grandparents. After enough generations, continuity becomes difficult to recognize. The civilization has not truly vanished. It has become something else. Modern archaeological science embraces this nuanced understanding. Researchers no longer search only for dramatic collapse. They investigate resilience, adaptation, migration, cultural exchange, environmental response. These processes better reflect the complexity of real human societies. The forgotten civilization reminds scholars that history rarely divides neatly into beginnings and endings. Instead, civilizations resemble living ecosystems. They grow, adapt, expand, contract, exchange ideas with neighbors, respond to changing climates, absorb newcomers, influence surrounding cultures. Eventually, they transform so completely that later generations assign them different names. Standing among the ruins today, it is tempting to imagine a single defining moment when everything changes forever. The evidence resists that temptation. No dramatic final battle, no mysterious disappearance overnight, no hidden technology suddenly lost, no single explanation fully accounts for what happens. Instead, millions of ordinary decisions accumulate across centuries. Families choose where to live, farmers adapt to changing rivers, merchants follow new trade routes, children inherit different opportunities than their parents. Every generation nudges history in subtle directions. Only after many centuries does the combined result become visible. The civilization without a surviving name teaches perhaps the most valuable lesson archaeology can offer. Human history is rarely simple. Its greatest mysteries usually arise not because evidence is completely absent, but because reality is more intricate than any single story can comfortably explain. That complexity does not diminish the wonder. It deepens it. The true mystery is not how an entire civilization disappears overnight. It is how an entire civilization can change so gradually, so quietly, and so completely that thousands of years later the world must excavate the earth itself simply to remember that it was ever there at all. The more the forgotten civilization is understood, the more it changes the way historians think about every civilization that has ever existed. For centuries, history was often written as a sequence of great rulers, decisive battles, and spectacular monuments. Civilizations seem to appear suddenly dominate their neighbors and then vanish after dramatic catastrophes. Archaeology tells a quieter story. It reveals that the true foundations of civilization are usually built not by famous individuals, but by countless ordinary people whose names never survive, and that disappearance often means transformation rather than extinction. This realization has reshaped the study of the ancient world. Researchers now examine entire landscapes instead of isolated monuments. Satellite imagery, environmental reconstruction, and regional surveys reveal relationships between settlements that earlier generations never recognized. A single city no longer represents a civilization by itself. Instead, villages, roads, irrigation systems, seasonal camps, quarries, forests, and agricultural fields are understood as parts of one interconnected living system. The forgotten civilization demonstrates this principle remarkably well. Its strength never depends solely upon one capital or one ruling dynasty. Its resilience comes from thousands of communities cooperating across enormous distances. Food flows from fertile valleys toward growing towns. Craftsmen transform raw materials brought by merchants traveling hundreds of kilometers. Farmers maintain canals dug by ancestors they have never known. Religious traditions create shared identities across landscapes far larger than any single person can easily travel. Every ordinary action strengthens the larger network. The collapse of such a system therefore looks very different from the collapse of a centralized empire. There is no palace whose destruction ends everything, no single king whose death causes immediate chaos. Instead, connections weaken gradually. Trade slows. Communication becomes less reliable. Communities increasingly solve local problems without relying upon distant partners. Piece by piece, the network loses its coherence. The civilization fades not because every settlement disappears, but because the relationships connecting those settlements slowly dissolve. Modern historians increasingly recognize similar patterns elsewhere. Across the ancient world, environmental change, migration, technological innovation, and economic transformation repeatedly reshape societies without necessarily destroying the people living within them. The forgotten civilization becomes an important reminder that continuity often hides beneath apparent change. Even political collapse does not erase accumulated knowledge overnight. Roads continue guiding travelers. Terraces continue supporting agriculture. Water systems continue functioning. Families continue telling stories. Languages evolve while preserving older words. Religious beliefs absorb earlier traditions into new forms. History rarely begins from an empty landscape. One generation always inherits the achievements of another. This perspective also changes the meaning of archaeological ruins. Visitors often imagine abandoned cities as symbols of failure. In reality, many ruins represent extraordinary success. A city abandoned after existing continuously for 1,000 years has already achieved something remarkable. Its builders solved problems of food production, sanitation, water management, construction, and social cooperation that countless smaller communities never overcome. Its eventual transformation does not erase those accomplishments. Instead, the ruins become evidence of how long human ingenuity can sustain complex societies under changing conditions. The forgotten civilization also offers an unexpected lesson about humility. Modern societies often imagine themselves uniquely advanced. Ancient engineering reminds us that practical intelligence has deep roots. Long before satellites and computers, people learned to redirect rivers, cultivate difficult landscapes, organize large populations, and maintain extensive trade networks through observation, cooperation, and experience. Their tools are simpler. Their understanding of natural science is limited compared with modern knowledge. Yet their ability to solve practical problems remains deeply impressive. Perhaps even more remarkable is their patience. Many of the civilization's greatest achievements require generations rather than years. Canal systems expand gradually. Agricultural knowledge accumulates through repeated experimentation. Settlements grow slowly as each generation improves what the previous one leaves behind. No single individual witnesses the completion of the larger project. Civilization itself becomes an act of trust between people separated by time. Parents plant orchards whose fullest harvests will nourish grandchildren. Builders lay foundations expecting descendants to maintain them. Farmers enrich soil knowing others will cultivate the same fields long after they're gone. This long view is one of humanity's greatest strengths. Ironically, it also creates vulnerability. When environmental conditions begin changing, societies naturally expect familiar patterns to return because they have done so before. Communities invest enormous effort preserving existing systems rather than abandoning them immediately. That conservatism is understandable. It has usually worked. Only in hindsight does it become obvious that more fundamental adaptation may have been necessary. The forgotten civilization reminds us that people living through historical change rarely understand its full significance. No parent tells a child that they belong to the last generation of a great civilization. No farmer realizes that future archaeologists will study the abandoned field beneath their feet. History is almost never experienced as history. It is experienced as ordinary life. That insight creates an unexpected emotional connection across thousands of years. The people who build these settlements worry about harvests, family illness, weather, and uncertain futures much as people do today. They celebrate successful seasons. They grieve personal losses. They repair homes after storms. They hope their children will enjoy greater security than they themselves have known. These ambitions are profoundly familiar. The distance separating ancient and modern humanity suddenly feels much smaller. The forgotten civilization also demonstrates the extraordinary resilience of human communities. Despite environmental stress, economic disruption, and gradual fragmentation, people continue adapting for centuries. Migration becomes opportunity as well as necessity. New settlements emerge. Old traditions evolve. Knowledge survives because individuals carry it wherever they go. Collapse is never the whole story. Survival accompanies every transformation. Archaeologists increasingly emphasize this balance. Earlier scholarship sometimes portrayed ancient societies primarily through decline. Contemporary research pays equal attention to persistence. Which traditions continue? Which technologies spread? Which populations remain? Which landscapes are successfully adapted to new conditions? These questions reveal hope alongside loss. Perhaps that is the civilization's greatest legacy. Its disappearance forces humanity to reconsider what endurance truly means. A civilization does not survive only through monuments. Stone eventually cracks. Wood decays. Cities become forests. Roads disappear beneath fields. True endurance lies elsewhere. It exists in practical knowledge passed quietly between generations, in landscapes shaped so skillfully that later communities continue using them without remembering who first designed them, in descendants carrying forgotten ancestry, in customs whose origins vanish even while the traditions themselves continue. The civilization without a surviving name has therefore never been entirely lost. Its visible form disappears. Its invisible influence continues. Every new archaeological discovery strengthens that conclusion. The past is not buried because it has ceased to matter. It is buried because time continually builds new worlds upon the foundations of older ones. Those foundations remain beneath our feet whether we recognize them or not. The forgotten civilization asks one final question before its story reaches its quiet conclusion. If an organized society capable of sustaining millions of lives across centuries can fade so completely from written memory, how many other civilizations still wait undiscovered beneath forests, deserts, river valleys, coastlines, and modern cities? The answer remains uncertain, but every year, every excavation, every satellite survey, and every unexpected discovery suggests that humanity's shared history is far richer, far older, and far more interconnected than anyone imagined only a few generations ago. The final traces of the forgotten civilization are not found in ruined walls or buried streets. They exist in the realization that history itself is incomplete. Every map of the ancient world is only a temporary sketch revised whenever another settlement is uncovered beneath a field, another canal appears through satellite imagery, or another fragment of ancient DNA reshapes the story of human migration. The civilization that once seemed to vanish without leaving a trace has in a quiet way transformed the very way humanity understands its own past. Standing upon one of its former cities today requires imagination more than eyesight. The modern landscape appears calm and ordinary. Fields ripple beneath the wind. Birds circle above open ground. A narrow stream follows a course that has shifted many times since the last inhabitants walked beside it. There is little to suggest that thousands of people once filled this place with conversation, trade, celebration, and work. Only subtle rises in the earth hint that foundations still rest below. To an untrained visitor, nothing seems unusual. To an archaeologist, every uneven contour carries possibility. A slight change in vegetation may reveal a buried wall. An unusual concentration of pottery fragments may mark the location of a household occupied 4,000 years ago. A difference in soil color may indicate an ancient street or drainage channel. The landscape has not forgotten. It has simply learned a quieter language. This is perhaps archaeology's greatest gift. It teaches people to see what is invisible. An abandoned canal becomes evidence of cooperation between generations. A broken storage jar reveals networks of agriculture and trade. A discarded tool preserves the memory of hands that shaped it long after those hands have returned to the earth. History ceases to be a collection of famous names. It becomes a tapestry woven from millions of ordinary lives. The forgotten civilization reminds us that permanence has always been an illusion. Every society believes its cities will endure. Every generation assumes familiar institutions will continue indefinitely. Ancient builders almost certainly imagine that children yet unborn will maintain their roads, repair their canals, and inhabit their neighborhoods forever. For centuries they are correct. Then conditions begin changing, not all at once, not dramatically. One generation notices slightly different weather. The next adapts to new economic realities. Another settles in unfamiliar places. By the time the transformation is complete, no individual has witnessed the entire process. History has shifted quietly beneath countless ordinary days. That lesson reaches far beyond the ancient world. Modern civilization also depends upon intricate systems connecting distant regions. Food travels enormous distances before reaching dinner tables. Rivers are redirected. Forests are managed. Trade links continents. Digital communication binds societies together with a speed unimaginable to ancient peoples. Complexity has increased enormously. The underlying principle has not. Civilizations remain networks of relationships. Their strength depends upon cooperation as much as technology. Their resilience depends upon adaptation as much as stability. The forgotten civilization therefore offers neither a warning of inevitable collapse, nor a romantic celebration of vanished worlds. Instead, it offers perspective. Human history has always been a story of continual transformation. Communities emerge, expand, adapt, fragment, and merge again. Each generation inherits a world built by countless predecessors. Each leaves behind foundations, visible or invisible, for those who follow. Even disappearance becomes part of continuity. One of the most remarkable aspects of the archaeological record is how often apparent endings become unexpected beginnings. Abandoned fields eventually nourish forests. Collapsed buildings create fertile soil. Ancient roads influence the routes of modern highways. Forgotten irrigation systems shape later agriculture. Ruins become quarries supplying stone for new settlements. Nothing remains completely isolated from what comes afterward. Time does not erase, it rearranges. The civilization's greatest achievement may therefore lie not in what survives physically, but in what it demonstrates about humanity itself. People are extraordinarily adaptable. Given changing climates, shifting rivers, economic uncertainty, and political transformation, they rarely surrender completely. They adjust. They migrate. They cooperate. They preserve essential knowledge while allowing other traditions to evolve. This quiet resilience appears repeatedly throughout the archaeological record. It is one of the defining characteristics of the human story. The absence of a surviving name makes this civilization strangely universal. Had extensive written records endured, attention might focus upon famous rulers or dramatic events. Instead, anonymity directs attention toward ordinary experience. Farmers cultivating fertile soil, builders aligning streets with careful precision, children learning practical skills from parents, merchants carrying unfamiliar goods across distant landscapes, craftsmen refining techniques through patient repetition. These are the true architects of civilization. Their names disappear. Their influence does not. Every newly discovered settlement reinforces another important truth. History is never finished. Some of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the past few decades were completely unknown to previous generations. Entire urban landscapes have emerged beneath tropical forests through LiDAR surveys. Ancient harbors have been identified beneath coastal waters. DNA analysis has revealed migrations no historian once suspected. Future discoveries will almost certainly reshape today's understanding just as dramatically. The forgotten civilization remains unfinished not because evidence is lacking, but because discovery continues. Somewhere beneath a modern city, construction workers may one day uncover another district belonging to this ancient world. A drought may lower a reservoir enough to expose long-submerged buildings. A shifting desert dune may reveal the corner of an unknown settlement. Improved scientific techniques may recover information from artifacts already resting inside museum collections. The past is constantly revealing itself in unexpected ways. This continuing dialogue between present and past may be the civilization's most enduring legacy. Its people did not intend to become a mystery. They simply lived. They planted crops, repaired houses, traded with neighbors, celebrated changing seasons, mourned their losses, and hoped for the future, exactly as countless generations have done before and since. They could not know that the memory of their shared civilization would eventually dissolve, while the evidence of their everyday lives remained patiently preserved beneath the soil. Thousands of years later, that evidence invites a different kind of remembrance. Not the remembrance of emperors alone, not the remembrance of battles, but the remembrance of ordinary humanity. The civilization that vanished without leaving a trace did in truth leave countless traces. They were simply too quiet to hear for many centuries. Now, through archaeology, environmental science, genetics, and careful observation, those faint echoes are slowly becoming voices once again. They remind us that every landscape contains forgotten stories. Every river has carried generations whose names are no longer spoken. Every field may conceal foundations laid by hands long returned to dust. And every civilization, no matter how powerful or how humble, ultimately entrusts its memory not only to stone and writing, but to the patient earth itself, waiting for a distant future willing to listen. Word count 1087. Final wind down. The sun settles gently across the ancient landscape just as it has for thousands of years. Light stretches over quiet fields where crowded neighborhoods once stood over rivers that have wandered beyond their former banks and over low hills that conceal forgotten streets beneath layers of earth. Nothing in the evening silence reveals how many lives once unfolded here. There are no voices drifting through the air, no smoke rising from hearths, no merchants returning home before darkness. Yet the absence feels peaceful rather than empty, as though the land has simply folded the past into itself. The civilization that seemed to disappear without leaving a trace has never truly been gone. Its canals became part of the landscape, its roads guided later travelers, its fields nourished generations who no longer remembered who first cultivated them. Its descendants carried fragments of its knowledge into new communities where old traditions quietly blended with new ones. Even its forgotten cities continued shaping the world long after their names faded from memory. Perhaps that is the gentlest lesson the past offers. Human civilizations are not fixed monuments standing outside time. They are living currents constantly changing course like rivers crossing wide plains. They divide, merge slow, and gather strength again. What appears to be an ending from one point of view often becomes the beginning of something else entirely. Archaeology reminds us to look more carefully at ordinary places. A quiet meadow may once have been a marketplace. A forest path may follow a road first cleared thousands of years ago. A simple hill may hide generations of builders, farmers, craftsmen, and children whose lives were every bit as real as our own. The earth keeps these memories with remarkable patience, revealing them only a little at a time, and perhaps that is fitting. No civilization remembers everything about itself forever. Memory fades, landscapes change, languages evolve, yet traces remain waiting beneath soil, beneath water, beneath forests, and beneath the steady passage of time. As evening settles completely across the forgotten world, the ruins disappear once more into shadow. The wind moves softly through the grass, carrying no names and no explanations, only the quiet reminder that humanity has always been part of a story far older, far larger, and far more enduring than any single civilization could ever know.